Helen finally got an appointment with Dr. Berger, a luminary of modern medicine who rarely saw people off the street, mostly on recommendation, but she was lucky. Although, as one might say, it was luck that Dr. Berger stunned the girl with unpleasant news. It turns out that traditional medicine did not know how to treat her illness. The doctor said that her illness was called flower manna, and he couldn't understand how anyone could have gotten into such a state. The disease manifested itself as black spots on the skin, similar to flowers, and it arose due to a disruption in the flow of manna in the body of a person endowed with power. Dr. Berger spoke at length about the disease and its nature, but the result was disappointing. He did not know of a cure for the infection called flower manna. Dr. Berger knew about the grief that had befallen Helen. Her father had recently died, and now she herself had fallen ill. He felt sorry that he had no way to help the girl. The only thing Berger could offer was general strengthening pills. They increased the body's resistance and slowed the progression of the disease. Helen wondered how long she could last taking these pills. Dr. Berger's message was disappointing. He only guaranteed the girl 3 years of normal life, after which she would begin to fade away. Helen left Dr. Berger's office in a foul mood. Who would like to know that she had no more than 3 years left of normal life? Depression overwhelmed Helen. It was so absurd that she didn't want to believe it. Providence gave Helen a second life, but here too, she was given a very short time. It was some kind of irony of fate. Some people live for many years, get married, have children, raise them. But Helen, for the second time, barely made it to 25. Helen Flinton is a brilliant heiress of the Flinton family. At the age of 16, she inherited the title of Viscountess. At first glance, Helen's life in a huge mansion might seem easy and rich. It seemed that the girl had everything one could dream of. In fact, Helen had no family, no home, no fortune. She was an impoverished, ruined aristocrat. It wasn't always like this. As a child, under the care of her father, a successful entrepreneur, Helen lived in love and prosperity. Around the same time that Helen entered the academy, her family's affairs began to decline, and her life went downhill. Helen's father, Viscount Marat Flinton, always helped his friends. One day his friend, Earl Lever, begged him on his knees to help him. Marat answered the Count that he would definitely help him, so why do he need friends then? Marat did not expect that his best friend, Count Lever, would slip him a forged bill of exchange for signature, according to which Flinton would be obligated to cover all his debts. This ruse allowed Lever to get rid of his debts and get the Viscount's fortune into his personal possession. Viscount Marat Flinton could not suspect such treachery on the part of the Count. The result was the complete ruin of the Viscount's family. The numerous debts of the Earl of Lever devastated all the Flinton assets. Marat, Helen's father, was busy trying to find money to at least pay the interest, but he was unable to do so. Helen concentrated on her studies. It was the only thing she could do. Her father didn't want to hear about his daughter going to work. Rumors of the Flintons' bankruptcy were spreading, and many people at the academy made fun of Helen. But this didn't bother the girl too much. Helen had one goal: to study hard, earn money, and live happily with her father again, until an irreparable tragedy happened. The girl found her father at home. Marat Flinton could not bear the shame of bankruptcy and poverty, and took his own life, leaving his daughter alone. Shocked by the appearance of her father, who had committed suicide, Helen lost consciousness next to his body. It is noteworthy that during the several days that Helen was unconscious, countless waves of childhood memories washed over her. At first, the main character in them was Helen's father. He was always attentive to his daughter and loved her to the point of madness. Suddenly, memories of her past life came flooding back into Helen's mind. There, everything was no less sad. Immediately after birth, the girl was abandoned in an orphanage, and when she entered high school, she was diagnosed with an incurable disease. In her past life, Helen saw herself as a lonely girl waiting to die. The current Helen Flinton is a minor character in the novel Everybody Loves the Saint, which she herself read before her death. Helen reasoned that rebirth itself was good. In this life, she knew family warmth. But why was Providence playing such an evil joke on her? Why is Helen mortally ill in this life? Was it really impossible to play out a different scenario? Having sold all her property to pay off her debts, Helen held her father's modest funeral alone. No one came to see him off. Less than a week had passed since the funeral, and the girl had not yet fully recovered from this shock, when it turned out that she was also terminally ill. Helen was happy that she had the power and could become a magician. But in reality, it turned against her. Helen's power was the ability to control other people's dreams. Helen learned that she had this power while graduating from the academy. Helen wanted to ease her father's condition a little and move him to the bedroom, but when she touched him, she felt a warm light coming out of her hand. The next day, my father told me that he had a good dream, as if he and Helen had gone on a picnic to the lake, and he felt good and calm there. Now Helen was dying due to the distortion of the mana flows, which was the source of this power, if it were possible to unravel mana like yarn. Suddenly, Helen remembered information from an old manuscript that she had come across by chance when she was working on her final thesis at the academy. Helen shook herself. There was a small hope that the mana flow would be restored. Then the girl would be able to survive. In their world, there was an artifact capable of changing the flow of mana. It was a family heirloom of the ducal Merchetz family. The Merchetz clan received a blessing not from the White Goddess, but from a demon, and their relic contained the power to control the flows of mana in this world. It dawned on Helen how come she hadn't remembered this before. It was an important detail in this novel. If she acquired it, she would live on in this world for a long time. There was one problem, though, and that was that only the current Duke Merchettis had access to this artifact. Moreover, this very Duke Cardien Merchettis, according to the plot of the novel, was a villain and the second main male character. Cardien, who lives in eternal torment because he has no control over his power, meets Saint Celestine and is temporarily freed from his suffering. However, Cardien's obsession with Celestine and his madness due to the disruption of the mana flows gradually escalated, and eventually he met a tragic end. Helen couldn't figure out how she could ask such a man to lend her a family heirloom. It was necessary to come up with a way for the ruined aristocrat to get closer to the Duke. Helen did not believe that this was possible at all. The girl thought it was reckless on her part, but nevertheless, she had no other choice. Providence finally took pity on Helen and pointed out an advertisement to her, the contents of which interested the girl. It was nothing more than an announcement that the Merchetz Duchy estate needed a full-time governess. Helen decided that this was her only chance. If she was hired, she would kill two birds with one stone. There was one nuance. The advert was posted 2 weeks ago, so most likely the Dukes had already hired someone during this time. Helen understood only one thing. If she could not use the power of the relic, then in this life she would die very early again. Therefore, the girl decided not to guess, but to try to go to the Duke's estate. Maybe luck would smile on her. Helen was not going to wait for her own death with her hands folded, and so she urgently hired a carriage with a coachman. The girl demanded that she be immediately taken to the Duchy of Merchettis. Helen had no choice but to try all possible methods. The estate of the Dukes of Merchettis struck Helen at first sight. She even remembered a childhood joke about a palace being like a rich chest. Having known a thing or two about luxury since childhood, Helen was shocked by the family's wealth, although it was not a particular revelation to the girl. Helen knew very well that the empire was ruled by three forces: the imperial family, the temple, and the Merchet dukes. The estate's furnishings met the highest standards. The expensive and opulent atmosphere began as soon as one entered the palace grounds. An annoying thought crossed the girl's mind. If she had had that much money, perhaps her father would still be alive. But Helen shouldn't think about this now. The girl's goal was simple. She had to survive. Helen's thoughts were interrupted by a woman's scream, someone loudly asking the young gentleman to stop. A boy of about 10 years old knocked Helen down, and at the same time, the little brat shouted at someone not to dare follow him. The boy rushed further down the road. Helen found herself in an awkward position. It's good that the maid saw all this and called the butler. The servants split up, and several followed the boy in a vain attempt to catch up with him. One of the girls stopped and helped Helen up, and she told her that she had come here because of an advertisement for a governess. It immediately dawned on Helen that this young gentleman was the very child she would have to teach. Watching the boy quickly run away, the girl realized that she would have a difficult job. Chief Butler Winston Gregory approached the girl, introduced himself, and apologized for his rudeness towards her as a guest visiting the duchy. Winston apologized for the young gentleman's rudeness, and at the same time asked if the girl was hurt. Helen cheerfully reported that she had escaped with only a slight fright. Butler Winston was glad that everything had turned out well and asked what brought the girl to the Merchetz estate. The maid immediately informed Winston that the lady had come in response to an advertisement for a governess. Helen confirmed the maid's words, but the butler's reaction was unclear. Either he was glad to see the governess, or he was very puzzled by something. Winston informed the lady that the conversation could drag on for a long time, and suggested that Helen go into the palace. Helen felt that there was some problem. The girl sincerely hoped that nothing serious had happened, and as for the mischievous boy, that wasn't the biggest problem. The acquaintance with the butler and the estate's rules continued over a cup of aromatic tea. Helen was seated at a modestly set but neat table opposite the butler, and Winston asked if she had really come to apply for a job as a governess. The girl introduced herself as Helen Flinton and graduated from the Imperial Academy. The butler reported that they had already hired a new governess for the young gentleman, so the vacancy was closed. Winston regretted that he had not taken down the advert immediately, and the butler was sorry that, because of him, the girl had come such a long way in vain. Helen knew she would be turned down right from the start. Luck wasn't her strong point, but she wasn't planning on leaving just like that. Winston heard the name Flinton and remembered that the Viscount had committed suicide and that the family was ruined after his death. Upon learning that Helen had no references, Winston completely lost interest in her and assured her that they would pay Helen a small compensation for the inconvenience. Helen realized that if they were telling her that, there was no chance of negotiations, although judging by the fact that the ad had been up for 2 whole weeks, that was exactly what she should have expected. However, Helen couldn't just give in. She had one last trump card. She said that she should have come earlier and refused compensation. The girl thanked the butler for the tea and decided to leave. The butler offered to prepare a carriage for her. Helen stood up from the table and caught her shoe on the leg of a chair, and the girl fell to the floor with a huge thud. It was a planned fall. It was supposed to help Helen stay in the estate. Helen's suitcase opened, and the girl's papers spilled out, and the butler became alarmed that Helen had twisted her ankle when she collided with the young gentleman. Winston ordered that a carriage be prepared immediately for Lady Flinton. Helen should sit down, and he would collect all her things. While collecting Helen's papers, the butler discovered a very interesting document. It was a ruby diploma from the Academy. Winston couldn't believe that the daughter of a ruined viscount could have such a thing. This document confirmed that this girl was one of the best graduates of the Imperial Academy. Helen asked what papers the butler was looking at so carefully. Maybe she could explain something to him. Winston asked the girl for forgiveness and invited her to stay for tea. He did not want to let her go with an injured leg, as this could damage the reputation of the duchy. Helen realized that the butler had seen her diploma and lied, saying that after visiting here, she was going to the Imperial Palace to take the place of the prince's teacher. The butler was intrigued. The possibility of getting a governess of such caliber that she would be invited to the prince was tempting for him. The girl decided that it was time to take her documents from the butler. He was looking at them too greedily. Helen's bait worked, and the butler offered the girl to become the teacher of young Master Vincent. Helen was surprised. Less than 5 minutes had passed since the butler announced that the young master already had a teacher. Winston confirmed that this is exactly what he said. But how could he have passed up such an outstanding candidate as Lady Flinton? And there are reasons for this. Unexpectedly, a mass of exquisite desserts and elite varieties of tea were quickly served on the table. Helen decided that she would not refuse these dishes. Her stomach had been rumbling for a long time. The butler reported that the young gentleman had a bad reputation among the elite governesses. The candidate they found was far below the level Vincent required. And then suddenly, Helen appeared with a ruby diploma. The butler immediately offered Helen a contract for the position of governess, guaranteeing the most favorable conditions. Winston suggested that Helen fill out the contract according to her wishes and put her signature under them. They would try to fulfill everything. Helen was happy. Everything was going according to her plans so far, and she was able to join the Merchet's family. Helen accepted the butler's offer. Now she needs to wait for the right moment, get the artifact, and escape from the mansion. The butler was touched. Helen could have refused, citing his previous attitude, but she generously agreed. Remaining in the room that Helen had been assigned as a teacher, she rejoiced. The break-in into the mansion had been successful. The butler was unusually kind. He advised Helen to rest in the room prepared for her, and they would send for her things tomorrow. Helen initially thought she would have a guest room, but the apartment provided to her exceeded all expectations. The bathroom was larger than her room, and the bedroom was larger than the living room in her own mansion. Helen was convinced that the more money one has, the more luxuriously one lives. The tension of this unusually long and tiring day subsided, and the girl felt incredibly tired. The flower disease of MANHWA troubled Helen, dying from black flowers blooming on her body, a sad romance. Helen was afraid of death, but this was not her path. The girl was going to survive. Death is just death, Helen thought. It's better to survive and live in torment than to die romantically. Len remembered the boy who was called Young Master. It turned out that it was Vincent. Vincent Mercedes was the adopted son of the Duke of Cardienne. He took him from an orphanage. He was called the little devil of the Mercedes family. There were persistent rumors that Vincent refused to go to the academy and was abusing his governesses in every possible way, forcing them out of the mansion. Now Helen's main goal was to get closer to Vincent. And to do this, she used information from the novel she read in her past life. The fatigue disappeared. The girl felt a surge of adrenaline and began to think quickly. Helen quickly calculated how old Vincent was. Cardienne was turning 26 this year, which meant Vincent must be 10. At that very moment, the girl clearly remembered one important moment she had read in the novel. One gloomy and rainy day, Vincent sadly climbed the western hill. The boy did not pay attention to the rain or the cold. Helen jumped out of bed, quickly got dressed, and rushed to the exit of the mansion. The girl ran to Vincent and remembered that it was written that the boy, leaning against an old tree, was yearning for a man who would never come. Helen, remembering the description of the novel, quickly found the western hill and the lonely child in the rain. The boy stood under a spreading tree and did not pay attention to what was happening around him. The end of his waiting would come when he turned 12 years old. Vincent heard Helen's footsteps and looked around with displeasure to see who else dared to disturb him. The boy turned his face to the tree and pretended not to notice the girl. He probably expected that Helen would quickly leave, frightened by the bad weather. Helen was convinced that this was the same child she had seen recently. The novel said that Vincent had awakened at the age of 12 and killed his father. Vincent Loa Mercedes is the family's little devil, its hope and its bane, and it is with him that Helen will have to deal. The boy came to the Merchet's family when he was about 3 years old. He was a blood relative to them, but for some reason he lived in an orphanage. One of the gray days at the orphanage, the class teacher came to Vincent, and with her a richly dressed gentleman. The boy was told that this was Duke Merchet's his new father. Vincent was the son of Cardienne's older brother, which is why the boy was taken from the orphanage. After this, Cardienne made his nephew Vincent his adopted son and heir to his entire fortune. As soon as Vincent received the surname Mercedes, people started gossiping about him in society, saying that he was illegitimate and that nothing was known about his mother. Vincent felt like everyone hated him, including his adoptive father, and other children made fun of him because of his background. The governesses didn't so much teach him as mock him for his awkwardness and inability to do things like aristocrats. Vincent thought that because of his low origin, no one loved him, and very soon they would return him to the orphanage again. The boy suffered the contempt and hatred of this world. Helen, who herself had no friends while studying at the academy, heard rumors about him. One can imagine how hard it was for the boy to endure all the gossip and whispers around him. Vincent, who had suffered all his life, directed his anger at his adoptive father, who took him from the orphanage, and at the age of 13, he got rid of him. Vincent stated that he never considered him his father for a moment, but only hated Cardienne, and believed that he did not care about him at all. Cardienne's story was no less tragic, and the novel had 3 main male characters. The real protagonist, who ends up with the heroine in the end, is Crown Prince Hysterion Lagrangesia. The second main character is the Holy Knight Eden Acarium, who takes up a significant amount of space in the narrative. The last main character was the villain Cardienne Mercedes, the negative character of the novel. Cardienne Mercedes, the first villain and second protagonist of the novel, was killed by his adopted son at a tragic moment for him. The main character, Celestine, chose another man over Cardienne, and as a result of an accident, he became crippled. Cardienne suffered incredible torment because the main character rejected him. Perhaps Celestine could have saved Cardienne, but her adopted son left no chance for a happy ending, plunging a dagger into his chest. However, as Helen remembered, today's events took place long before Cardienne met Celestine. Maybe he was bitter and lonely now, Helen thought. The girl decided that she had enough of thinking about the Duke and his adopted son. She needed to take care of herself first, and then feel sorry for others. It was necessary to act, and first of all, in order to get closer to Duke Cardienne, it was necessary first of all to become friends with Vincent. The kid is now wallowing in self-pity and propping up a huge tree, and it's completely unknown what he's thinking about. Vincent got tired of pretending not to notice the girl and asked who was walking there. Helen decided to be polite and make a good first impression on the boy. The girl came out from behind the bushes and, putting on her most amiable smile, greeted Vincent. The boy's gaze was full of suspicion, which is what Helen expected. She knows that Vincent is a difficult child. Helen understood that he was wary because she appeared suddenly, but it was good that she found him here. Now she needed to try to talk. The girl explained that she was walking, and suddenly it started to rain. While trying to escape, she found herself under the tree where the boy was also hiding from the rain. Vincent continued to look at the uninvited guest with displeasure. Hostility was visible in his gaze. Helen smiled sweetly and said that if she was bothering him, she could leave. Vincent stated that the girl did not bother him at all, and he could not throw the person out into the pouring rain. Helen found the guy quite nice. Maybe because he relaxed a little, the girl wanted to pinch him, but then he would probably hate her. The novel stated that Vincent had a deep dislike for governesses, so Helen needed to get close to the boy before classes began. Helen's original plan was to slowly bond with the boy, working through his trauma and getting him interested in activities. However, it was difficult to pass by the child standing in the rain. But how could she overcome Vincent's wariness? The boy turned away. Apparently, Helen's company embarrassed him. Helen was afraid that he might only feel negative emotions towards her. The girl was afraid that she had looked too closely at Vincent, and now she needed to apologize. But the boy didn't look unhappy or angry. Helen got the impression that this child was very afraid of something. Watching Vincent tremble slightly, Helen felt a sense of déjà vu and was reminded of her past life. They said about Helen that she was an orphan, and also terminally ill. All the misfortunes of the world fell on this girl. And what if you could get infected from her if you touched her? Many of the words Helen heard in her past life sounded too scientific and scared her. Social phobia, fear of people. At that moment, the girl began to understand Vincent's feelings. She could no longer leave one child who was suffering from the same pain as she was. Helen saw in the boy not an embittered little demon, but a lonely child, forgotten and abandoned by everyone. The girl didn't think long. The words burst from her lips on their own. She invited Vincent to become friends. The boy looked at the girl with distrust. Did she really not know who he was? Helen replied that she was also an aristocrat, and he was Vincent Merchetz, wasn't that right? Suddenly, the guy shouted that he was not talking about this, and that she definitely did not know who he really was. Vincent was on the verge of hysteria. He said that if the girl knew who he really was, she would not want to be friends with him. Bitter tears flowed from the boy's eyes. Helen silently empathized with him, so small, and already experienced so much pain. Helen asked permission to ask the boy a few important questions so that he could decide for himself how bad he was. The girl asked if Vincent had ever beaten anyone, or stolen anything from anyone, or if he had betrayed anyone. The guy said that such a thing had never happened. Helen concluded that since everything was so, she had no reason not to trust Vincent. The boy was perplexed. No adult had ever spoken to him like that. All he heard from those around him was that he was doing badly and that everyone was unhappy with him. The girl convinced the guy that she did not believe the rumors about him and would never listen to other adults or children scold Vincent. Helen stated that she only believes the Vincent she sees with her own eyes. The girl introduced herself as Helen Flinton and asked Vincent to be her friend. Surprisingly, it was at that moment that the rain stopped and the bright sun came out. Helen suggested that Vincent go back to the mansion together, where a delicious dinner would await them, and they would also be able to play something. Butler Winston knocked on the door of Duke Cardien Marchetti's office. It was necessary to report to the master about the latest events in the estate. Cardien was busy reading ancient manuscripts. He was looking for answers to many questions. The Duke lit his favorite pipe, and the butler's visit distracted him from what he considered to be important thoughts. The butler reported that he had hired another governess for Vincent, a talented girl who had graduated from the Imperial Academy with a ruby diploma. The Duke replied that he had made the butler responsible for the heir's education and that he did not need to be informed about every little detail. The butler reported that the boy was ill because he got wet in the rain, and he called a doctor for him. Now Vincent is sleeping. Cardien became worried and decided to go see how his adopted son was doing. Night fell like a black blanket over the Duke of Cardien's mansion, but not all of its inhabitants slept tonight. Helen found out that Vincent's room was in the west wing, on the 3rd floor, at the very end of the corridor. The girl decided to quietly visit the boy and see how he was feeling after a walk on a rainy evening. A few hours ago, when Helen and Vincent entered the mansion, the girl saw that the baby was chilled, although they had only been in the rain for a short time. On the way to the mansion, the girl noticed that Vincent was coughing heavily, and in the warmth, his cough became even worse. Helen was worried about the boy's health and was wondering how she could quickly cure him. Suddenly, Vincent pulled his hand out of hers and ran away without saying a word. Looking after Vincent, Helen thought that she had been mistaken in assuming that she had become close to this child. Perhaps she had been hasty in considering herself his friend. Looking around, Helen discovered that the butler was standing next to her. Winston asked what had happened to her. Helen explained that she found Vincent in the park under a tree and persuaded him to come into the house. He had a fever and a cough. The boy needed to take medicine, but he ran away. The butler explained that the young gentleman had a habit of hiding his ill health from everyone, and Winston was grateful to Helen for telling him about it. Helen shifted hesitantly near the door of Vincent's room. The girl felt out of place walking around a strange house at night. Helen decided that if she saw Winston there, she would not go in, but would immediately return to her room. The heir of Duke Cardian was alone. The boy slept restlessly, muttering something in his sleep and whining quietly. Helen came closer and saw that the sleeping baby had tears streaming from his eyes. Vincent had seen something in his dream that upset him and made him cry. The girl was outraged that everyone could leave, leaving the sick child alone. It was outrageous. Helen heard Vincent asking in his sleep that his mother should not leave, and the girl realized that the guy didn't just have a cold, it was a psychopathic state. The girl remembered that the butler had said that Vincent was feverish every time it rained, and now he was having a nightmare. Helen was filled with compassion for the boy, who was experiencing pain that was excessive for his age. The girl mentally asked Vincent not to worry. She couldn't change reality, but she could change his dreams. Helen leaned over the boy, closed her eyes, and concentrated on positive emotions. The warm light from Helen's palm illuminated Vincent's face. The boy gradually calmed down. His breathing evened out. Helen opened her eyes to check how her power was affecting the child. Vincent was fast asleep and smiling. He called his mother again, but there was no longer sadness in his voice. The girl was glad that the boy met his mother, at least in a dream. Unfortunately, she could not do anything more for him. Helen was convinced that the child was feeling much better, which meant it was time for her to return to her room. Helen left the room, hoping she wouldn't meet anyone, but then she ran into the butler, Winston, and Duke Cardian. Winston did not immediately recognize Helen in the flickering candlelight and asked menacingly who was wandering around the young gentleman's room at such a late hour. Helen recognized the butler's voice, and next to him stood, of course, Duke Cardian, Mercedes himself. She needed this man to survive. But how terrible he is, thought Helen. These lifeless dry eyes, pale skin, and bloodless lips. He looks like a walking dead man. These are symptoms of a terrible disease, popularly called madness, but in reality it is a side effect of a magical storm. Unfortunately, the fact that this is a side effect will only become known after the death of Duke Cardian. The butler asked what Helen was doing there. She replied that she was bringing medicine to the boy because she was worried about him. Helen was sure that someone was looking after the young gentleman and did not expect at all that the sick boy would be alone in the room. Duke Cardian cut off Helen's excuses and ordered the butler to check on the heir's condition. The Duke stated that if his son became worse because of the new governess, she would be held responsible. Helen noted that Duke Cardian seemed incapable of emotion, even when it came to his son. Albeit an adopted one, he was as cold as ice. That is why he seemed like a complete stranger to Vincent, and did not evoke warm feelings in anyone around him. The butler recommended that Helen return to her room and decided to post a guard at her door to prevent any unforeseen situations. Helen replied that the butler and the Duke could do as they saw fit and decided to disappear from their sight as quickly as possible. Cardian looked at the girl with a cold, icy gaze. He didn't trust new people. Helen returned to the room and only now realized how scared and tired she was. Falling onto the bed, the girl was annoyed that she had to get involved in an unpleasant matter with Cardian. He was getting rid of everything that was bothering him. If Helen is careless, she could easily become the Duke's next victim. As for madness, Helen remembered that now the Duke could not control his magic. His condition was so bad that he had to smoke a special herb. The Duke was having a hard time. The herb temporarily relieved his headache, but his insomnia did not go away. He had not slept for almost a week. Helen thought, even in such a sickly state, The Duke was very handsome, if he could be treated. Then it would be possible to start a romantic relationship. The girl pulled herself up short. What useless thoughts. They only gave her a headache. She couldn't do anything anyway. It was better to try to sleep. A gentle moon looked into Helen's room, its light trying to lull the girl, instilling hope for a happy future. The moon gave way to a bright, sunny morning. It was no less beautiful than a starry night, but it did not bring Helen any relief. The girl still couldn't sleep. She had only been in the duchy for one day, but she had already ended up under house arrest and couldn't leave peacefully. Would they really kick her out? There was a polite but insistent knock on the door of Helen's room. The girl shuddered. The butler had probably come to throw her out of the mansion. A maid stepped into the room at the permission to enter, introduced herself as Chelsea, and said that she was assigned to the lady as a servant. Helen was delighted that she had been assigned a maid and hastened to shake the hand of the girl who was called upon to make her life easier. Chelsea did not understand what Lady Helen wanted from her and recoiled in fear from the outstretched palm. Helen asked what was wrong. Chelsea replied that she didn't expect it from such a noblewoman, ladies, that she will extend her hand to shake. Most of the maids were recruited from impoverished nobles and commoners. Usually, the masters see them not as people, but as tools and instruments of labor. Helen wanted to establish a trusting relationship with Chelsea, to make her her ally. She extended her hands to the maid and expressed hope that they would work together. The girls shook hands with great friendliness and desire. Chesley announced that she had already prepared breakfast for Helen and invited the girl to the table. Helen was surprised by the abundance and variety of dishes served. She wanted to try everything. Now there was clearly no need to worry about being kicked out. Since they were feeding her, she needed to eat. A full stomach was much better than a hungry one. The breakfast was magnificent, and Helen thought that she had never been fed so deliciously anywhere as in the house of the Empire's chief villain. The Duke of Cardian's estate was incredibly beautiful. It was hard to believe that it belonged to the novel's main villain. The butler came to Helen and asked how she was feeling and whether she had slept well. After a delicious and hearty breakfast, Helen's mood improved, and she sincerely thanked Winston for his concern. The butler called the guards away and invited Helen into the living room. It seemed that all suspicions regarding the girl had been dispelled, and this made her happy. The butler announced that Vincent's other teacher had already arrived, and Helen was eagerly awaiting a meeting with the governess from the novel. Helen remembered Vincent's words about the teacher, saying that the Duke did not consider the boy his son, and she was the only one who thought about him. There were many reasons for the estrangement between the Duke and his adopted son, but the governess also had a negative impact on their relationship. Helen entered the room and froze in surprise. The girl standing with her back to her seemed familiar to her. It was hard to imagine that Vincent's governess was Anna Lever, a more unpleasant person. Anna was no less surprised than Helen to see Viscountess Flinton at the Duke of Cardian's mansion as another of the young master's teachers. Lever pulled herself together and immediately feigned wild joy at meeting her former classmate. Anna hugged Helen and remembered how well they got along as children and at school, and suggested that they continue to maintain a good relationship. Helen was speechless. If anyone saw the girls now, they might believe that they were real friends. Anna hastened to inform the butler that she and Helen had been friends since childhood. Their fathers had been on good terms, and they had been in the same class at the academy. Anna turned to Helen and, smiling sweetly, said that annoying fate had brought them together under the same roof again. Helen agreed with Lady Lever. Fate was indeed too intrusive. The butler suggested dividing Vincent's study time into 3 hours in the morning and 3 hours in the afternoon. Anna immediately expressed her concern that Helen would not be able to get closer to the young gentleman. She herself was not very good at it. Anna believed that Vincent would never accept another tutor. Helen looked at the girl with irritation. She was not going to remain silent. The butler hastened to reassure the worried Anna. She should not worry about Helen's ability to get along with children. The young gentleman has already accepted a new tutor and even made friends with Miss Flinton. Helen thanked the butler for the arrangements and agreed to take over the afternoon classes. The butler agreed with Helen and ordered that classes, according to the new schedule, would begin the day after tomorrow. Helen reacted calmly to Anna's attacks. The girl was sure that this time everything would be as she had decided. Anna and Helen asked the butler for permission to leave, but Winston asked Helen to stay. The girl readily agreed. She had nowhere to rush anyway, and she remained in the office with the butler. Winston asked if Vincent was telling the truth about Helen helping him when he had a fever. Helen was surprised that the young gentleman told the butler about this. The turn of events was unexpected. The girl thought that Vincent was asleep when she came to see him. The butler remarked that it was difficult for him to understand the girl's actions, but she had rendered a great service to the young master, and Winston thanked her for it. Helen thought it was very sweet and touching that the boy stood up for her. The butler noted that he had served in this duchy for a long time, and this was the first time he had seen the young master protect someone. The butler looked at Helen with hope. Maybe this girl could change the young master. Helen parted with the butler and immediately ran into Anna, waiting for her in the corridor. Now they could talk. Anna angrily asked how and why Helen got a job as a tutor in this mansion, and demanded that the girl reveal her true intentions. Helen laughed. That was Anna. When no one was around, she showed her true face. Anna was puzzled why Helen was laughing, but she replied that she did not understand her former classmate's hostile attitude. It was she and her father who had taken everything from Helen. Anna and Helen's relationship was like that of a creditor's daughter and a debtor's daughter. They first met when Helen was 9 years old. Anne was the daughter of her father's best friend, Count Levere, the same one who had tricked the Viscount into paying his debts. In public, Anna looked like a sweet girl, and even said that she wanted to be friends. But her fake smile immediately disappeared as soon as the girls were alone. Anna threw and broke Helen's toys and refused to play with her. Anna declared that a loser like Helen could not be her friend, and she would not play with her. Of course, it would have been possible to simply not meet such an acquaintance, but it so happened that the girls ended up in the same class at the Imperial Academy. Here Anna spread rumors that Helen's father owed Anna's father a lot of money because he had lost everything in gambling and begged him on his knees for help. Helen could not prove that this was a lie, and that Anna's father had basely deceived her father. They laughed at her, called her a beggar and the shame of the academy. Anna took sadistic pleasure in tormenting Helen, but she always kept a low profile and did dirty deeds through other people's hands. Where there were no witnesses, Anna's bullying became more sophisticated and vicious. This girl was capable of any meanness. It ended with the fact that, thanks to Anna's efforts, Helen found herself in complete isolation. No one wanted to be friends with her. Despite this, Helen studied hard. Isolation from parties and friends allowed her to devote a lot of time to mastering knowledge. Moreover, Helen did not want to give in to Anna in her studies and tried her best to be the best in everything. But now, Helen was not going to cower in fear. Her time had come to gain the upper hand over Anna. Death stands behind Helen and gives her strength. Now the girl has nothing to fear. Helen told Anna that she was no longer afraid of her and thought that she still knew what would happen next with this lady, of course, thanks to the novel. Anna asked if Helen was really going to take revenge on her, that she was going to shout everywhere that Anna had taken away everything that belonged to her. Helen said that Anna overestimates her place in her life, and she is not going to waste her efforts on revenge on her. The debt is fully repaid, and Helen is no longer in debt to the Lever family, which means they simply have nothing more to talk about. Helen expressed the hope that Anna understood what she was talking about and would no longer tire her with her presence. Anna tried to stop Helen. She shouted after her that she had not finished yet and had something to say. Helen didn't react to her. She thought that Anna had scared her before, but now she was glad of the fact that the governess from the novel was indeed Anna. Of course, Miss Lever will do everything to drive Helen out of the mansion and away from young Vincent. In that case, Helen reserved the full right to retaliate. She had no intention of giving up her position as Vincent's governess to Anna. Anna growled after the girl that she would not get away with this and that she would take revenge for the insult. Miss Lever was breathing malice and was going to make Helen regret that she had ever been born and showed up in this mansion. Beautiful apple trees grew along the road. This year the harvest was abundant, and the smell of ripe fruit spread throughout the area. Helen walked along the apple trees and inhaled the wonderful aroma. She had lived in the mansion for a long time, but she was walking along this road for the first time. Butler Winston gave her a pass and sent her in this direction, but maybe she got lost and is actually going the wrong way. Very soon, the girl saw the goal of her walk in front of her. Helen circled the garden and found herself right next to the building she was looking for. It was a library, one of the main attractions of the Duke of Marchetti's estate. The library was huge, much larger than the imperial one. The entrance to it was guarded, and it was impossible to enter the building without a pass. The girl showed her pass and entered the library's huge hall. It was a true temple of knowledge. Helen came here to pick up books for the young master's teaching materials, but how to figure out where and what books are located in this huge building. She needed to ask someone. Helen was lucky. She noticed a young man near the window. The young man was sweet and greeted Helen kindly, calling her a beautiful fairy. Helen was embarrassed and could not find the courage to respond to the stranger with the same politeness. The girl pulled herself together. After all, it was impolite to behave like that, and Helen still received a decent upbringing. The girl smiled sweetly and introduced herself to the young man as Helen Flinton, the new governess of young Master Vincent. The young man replied that he was pleased to meet her and introduced himself as Ravon, the caretaker and librarian of Duke Marchetti's book collection. Helen was pleased to meet this young man. He was surprisingly handsome and friendly. The young people shook hands as a sign of good friendship and further cooperation. Ravon unexpectedly curtsied to the girl and kissed her hand. Apparently, she impressed him as more than just a friend. Helen was shocked by the library caretaker's behavior. No one had ever kissed her hand before. Kissing a hand is, of course, gentlemanly, but it was usually done at balls and receptions. In other cases, it indicated an intention to seduce a girl. Helen decided that Ravon simply didn't know how to greet someone properly, and decided not to embarrass the young man and ignore his behavior. The girl asked Ravon to tell her in which room she could find teaching aids for the young gentleman. Ravon had expected a different reaction, but since it was his direct responsibility to help navigate the library, he readily responded to Helen's request. The young man said that Helen should tell him the genre and title of the book, and then he would be able to find it easily. Helen handed Ravon the list of literature she needed, and the librarian asked her to wait while he collected everything she needed. Raven quickly found the books he needed and returned to Helen. The girl appreciated the young man's efforts. These were exactly the books she was looking for. Ravon asked if the girl was interested in old books, and if so, she could look into the room opposite. The door the librarian pointed to was the same color as the wall, and Helen didn't notice it. Raven said that outsiders weren't allowed in there, but she was an exception. Helen was intrigued, and Ravon had also said that she would definitely find something interesting in that room. The library custodian was very kind, and Helen decided to go to the indicated room. Moreover, the young man left her alone and went off to do his business. Helen decided that it was worth looking at the books in this room. Maybe she would really find an interesting copy there. Behind the door, a wonderful world of bookcases opened up before Helen. Everything sparkled with cleanliness, and there was no trace of the book dust that is typical of libraries. At first glance, Helen determined that there were many rare editions here. The girl's eyes simply ran wild. Helen's attention was drawn to a collection of fairy tales, exactly like the one they had in their house, and her father often read them to his daughter. It was a very rare specimen, and it was impossible to obtain exactly the same one in the Empire. The girl decided to at least look at the rare book and remember the happy moments of her childhood. Suddenly, she heard some kind of sound, like a cough or a groan. She was clearly not alone here. Helen walked around the shelf and saw a sofa on which a young man was sleeping. The girl's surprise knew no bounds. In front of her on the sofa lay the owner of the estate, the formidable Duke of Cardian. Helen was puzzled as to why the Duke was sleeping here, and what was more important was that Cardian looked extremely bad. It looked like he was having a nightmare. Sweat was running down the man's forehead, and he was twitching nervously in his sleep. Helen remembered that the Duke could hardly sleep due to the side effects of the magical storm, and when he did fall asleep, he had nightmares. The girl felt sorry for the Duke and decided that she could help him. Helen quietly approached the man and extended her hand to his head. Suddenly, Cardian intercepted her hand. The Duke's sleep was shallow and very sensitive. The Duke opened his eyes and asked what his nephew's governess was doing here. The man was not going to let go of the girl's hand, and Helen became a little scared. The Duke's awakening was too sudden, and he caught Helen in an ambiguous position. Helen, of course, was always looking for a way to be alone with him, but this situation frightened her. The girl immediately remembered that the Duke was not only the main character, but also the main villain of the novel she had read in her past life. Helen decided not to push things and quickly explain everything to him, but first she asked his lordship to let go of her hand. The girl told the Duke that she thought he was having a nightmare, and she just wanted to check if he was okay. Helen hastened to apologize to his lordship. She could not even imagine that he would be resting here. Helen quickly rattled off that his lordship should not misunderstand her, and hurried out of his sight. The door closed behind Helen with a soft thud, and only the faint scent of perfume remained as a reminder of her presence in the room. Cardian stared thoughtfully at the book that Helen had left on the table. The headache that had constantly tormented the Duke suddenly disappeared. The Duke strained his memory and remembered that this girl worked at their estate and was Vincent's governess. Cardian noticed the book the girl had left behind. It was popular children's fairy tales, or 12 stories for those who can't sleep. The Duke thought this was an odd choice for a young girl. It would have been more understandable if she had been interested in romance novels. Time flew by. Helen was settling into the mansion, preparing for classes with the Vincents, and finally, the first day of classes arrived. The memory of her first meeting with the boy still gave Helen goosebumps. The expression on the child's face spoke of his hostility and desire to get rid of him. Meeting the cold gaze of Duke Cardian, the confidence that he could be persuaded to give up the family heirloom melted like ice in summer. Helen doubted her own strength, but she still had no other choice. Helen decided that since she was already on the brink of the abyss, she had nothing to fear. She needed to solve problems as they came up, and now just conduct the first lesson. The girl tried to smile as welcomingly as possible and opened the door to the classroom. Here, an unexpected and very unpleasant surprise awaited her. Helen became confused and scared. The study room was empty. Vincent was not there at all. What could have happened to the boy? Helen was worried. The search began. First, Helen ran to the park, to the very tree under which she first found the young gentleman. Then, she visited the part of the mansion that offered beautiful views of nature and where everyone loved to relax. The girl even ran to the apple orchard. Perhaps the young gentleman fell asleep there, in the shade of the apple trees, or enjoyed the ripe fruits. 3 hours of searching yielded no results. Helen only became exhausted and returned back to the classroom. Helen tried to calm down and reasoned that since the boy was not in his favorite places, she knew only one place where he could hide: his room. It dawned on Helen that she hadn't remembered right away that the safest and most secluded place where children love to hide is the closet in his own room. In a past life, when Helen lived in an orphanage, many children, frightened, hid in the closet. In Vincent's room, the closet was large and apparently convenient. Helen walked up to the closet and knocked carefully on the door, quietly asking if the young gentleman was there. At first, it was very quiet, but after a few minutes, Helen heard some shuffling and panting in the closet. Helen breathed a sigh of relief. The boy was found. She said out loud that she was very scared when he disappeared. She thought that something could have happened. Vincent asked, without leaving the closet, if it was true that Helen was upset when he ran away. Helen replied that she was at first confused, but now she thought that the young gentleman's behavior did not surprise her too much. Vincent doesn't know her well, and anything unfamiliar can be very frightening even for an adult, in which case one always wants to run away and hide. Therefore, Helen believed that everything was within normal limits, and if the young gentleman hid in the closet or ran a short distance away, it would not be scary. The door creaked, and Vincent first peeked out from behind it timidly, then slowly crawled out of his hiding place. After standing for a while, he rushed to Helen with a request for forgiveness, hugged the girl tightly, and began to cry. Helen suggested that the boy take a walk to the fountains and calm down. Only after making sure that the boy had returned to normal did she begin asking questions. The girl asked what had frightened the young gentleman so much that he had hidden from her. Vincent was clearly getting nervous again, and Helen was getting ready to hunt him down all over the estate again. But the boy had no intention of running away. He said that he considered himself stupid and was afraid that the teacher would be disappointed in him. Vincent was told that Helen had been a genius since childhood, and therefore would not teach a fool like him, and would be very disappointed in him. The air clearly smelled of Anna Lever's tricks. No one but her could have said such stupid things to a child. Helen closed her eyes and took a deep breath. She couldn't show her anger now. Vincent might take it personally. The boy already considered himself pathetic. Helen had to spend a long time convincing him that she didn't think so, and was angry at a completely different person. The girl understood the pain this child was experiencing. This feeling of absolute loneliness and uselessness constantly tormented Helen herself. The girl knew the disgust and hopelessness of this feeling better than anyone else. Helen smiled openly at Vincent and said that she would never be disappointed in him. The boy asked why she was so sure of this. Maybe he was actually stupid and lazy. The girl replied that she was simply his teacher, and if the young master believed in her, she would reciprocate. Vincent still looked distrustful and scared, but he clearly felt a little better. Of course, the primary reason for Helene's rapprochement with Vincent was her desire to weaken the vigilance of the villainous Duke of Cardian. However, seeing what a lonely and wild child Vincent was, Helen wanted to help him find his place in the world. The girl wanted to become a support for the boy. The teacher and student walked quietly towards the mansion. Classes were missed. But something more important happened. The boy began to trust Helen. The rest is a matter of technique. It was already quite late when Helen and Vincent returned to the mansion. Here the boy hesitated, and it became clear that he was ready to say something important. Vincent said that tomorrow he would listen carefully to Lady Helen in class, so she must definitely come. He would be waiting. Helen was overcome with a feeling of tenderness and wild delight when Vincent extended his little finger to her. For a child, this was the highest degree of consolidation of their union. The girl replied that she would look forward to their lesson tomorrow. She had no doubt that the young gentleman would show excellent results. Naturally, Helen could not ignore Vincent's friendly gesture, and they cemented their union in the most reliable way that there was in the world. Shaking little fingers, so sweet, so naive, so childish. But there was nothing more reliable and stronger than this gesture. A delighted Vincent smiled, jumped up and down, and ran to his room, where dinner and a warm bed should already be waiting for him. Helen asked him not to hurry so much, he could fall, but she herself could not come to her senses because of the touching tenderness of the moment. Now she had to deal with Anna Lever. This woman was taking on too much. Helen couldn't just let it go. From a novel she'd read in a past life, she remembered what Anna's intrigues would lead to, and she was going to stop her activities. Suddenly, Helen felt a sharp pain in her shoulder. Her arm felt as if it had been burned by an electric shock. At the same time, everything started to swim before the girl's eyes. An unexpected weakness washed over her, and her legs became weak. The picture of the world became blurred, and Helen felt herself losing her balance and falling. Helen was just about to feel the full force of her fall to the floor, but someone's strong arms caught her. The girl opened her eyelids with difficulty and saw Duke Cardian next to her. It was he who caught her and prevented her from falling. Helen's surprise gave her a shot of adrenaline, which apparently helped her cope with her nausea. The girl asked how Duke Cardian ended up here, as he hadn't been in the hall a second ago, and why there was such unprecedented concern for an ordinary teacher. Helen knew for a fact that Cardian hated being touched, but he caught her when she fell and didn't feel any discomfort from the touch. The girl thanked the Duke, and Cardian pointed out to her that her nose was bleeding. Helen didn't immediately realize what exactly Cardian was pointing to. She felt nothing but a sudden weakness. The girl felt annoyed by such bad luck. Such a romantic moment was ruined by an absolutely unaesthetic picture. Helen became embarrassed, turned away from the Duke, and immediately left. Staying in the same room with this man was beyond her strength. Cardian looked thoughtfully after the girl who had run away. He decided that she was an interesting and mysterious person. No less mysterious to the Duke was his own reaction to touching this girl. He decided that she needed to be kept under surveillance. A new day had dawned. The sun was shining. The birds were singing. The sky was blue. The weather promised to be wonderful. Helen looked at the new floral pattern that had appeared on her shoulder. Such beauty, but in fact a symptom of a fatal illness. The girl came to the unambiguous conclusion that her illness yesterday was a symptom of flower disease. Helen remembered well that the doctor had warned that every time a new spot appeared, other symptoms would appear. Now, when weakness and dizziness began to appear, Helen realized how sick she was. She needed to hurry and first of all deal with Anna. Helen laid out in writing everything seditious she knew about Anna and her family. It was difficult to imagine what would happen when this was found out where it was needed. Helen didn't feel guilty. Anna and her father were the cause of Helen's father's death. And now, Anna could become the cause of the death of the Duke and his nephew. At this time, Anna paced the room in a fury. She was outraged that Helen had still not been thrown out of the mansion, despite all her efforts. Anna was infuriated that her former classmate had managed to get close to Duke Cardian. After the Duke caught Helen as she fell, the man stood for a long time and looked at the hand with which he had just held the girl. Anna saw this with her own eyes. In addition, the child, whom Anna had worked so hard to suppress and subjugate, suddenly began to constantly object and stand up for Helen. When Anna repeated again that the young gentleman had worked hard and was very smart, but that this was unlikely to satisfy Helen, she received an angry rebuke from Vincent. Anna was simply stunned by the harshness of the tone and the meaning of the words that her pupil uttered. Vincent looked angrily at Anna and said that it was better for her to remain silent than to speak badly about Helen's teacher, since she knew nothing about her. Vincent was sure that teacher Helen was kind, smart, and beautiful. Anna was unpleasantly surprised at how quickly Helen tamed this little animal, but Anna was not going to let things slide. To become a duchess, no one should stop her. Anna was determined to drive Helen out of the Duke of Cardien's mansion, no matter what it cost her. And she herself dreamed of becoming the wife of the owner of the mansion. The girl reasoned that she needed Helen to become the center of a huge scandal, and it didn't matter whether she was actually guilty or not. At this time, Anna caught sight of the maid, and the girl called out to her sharply. The maid approached Anna and asked what the lady needed. She ordered her to take one thing to Helen's room. Anna handed the maid a harmless-looking cloth bag containing dried herbs. Anna said it was a regular sleeping pill, assuming that if she was caught, she would blame the maid. The girl considered herself very cunning and decided that Helen Flinton would not be able to get out of it this time. Proud of her latest intrigue, Anna went for a walk in the mansion's park and dreamed of the time when everything here would belong to her. At this time, Helen was busy preparing a preemptive strike, as a result of which Anna would have to leave the Duke of Cardien's mansion. The carriage with the girl arrived at the street she needed, to the very establishment whose existence Helen knew about from the plot of the novel. It was a territory where the laws of the Empire did not apply, a home to all sorts of dark characters. Helen did not want to show everyone her true identity and kept a robe that completely hid her face and the outline of her body. She didn't come here just like that, but in search of an antique shop called Luna. The girl quickly found the right building and went inside. She found herself in a fairly decent little shop with a nice young man standing behind the counter. The young man smiled a customary smile and asked what exactly the lady was looking for. Helen doubted whether she remembered the plot of this novel correctly. It would be unpleasant to discover that she had confused it with another work. The girl gathered all her courage and said that she came here to find the moon. From the employee's reaction, Helen realized that she had not made a mistake and had done everything absolutely correctly. The young man became even more polite and invited her, as a special guest, to go into a room in a part of the house hidden from ordinary visitors. The Luna Antique Shop was a front for the best information guild in the Empire, and there were many ways to reach the guild's leaders. However, the password that Helen gave was of the highest category and allowed her to meet with the person who headed the information guild. Helen decided to use everything in her power to win the race against death. The clerk led Helen into a spacious office where a man wearing black glasses, gloves, and a robe like hers sat at a desk. The man was intrigued. It had been a long time since there had been guests who would personally look for him. Lemon, the head of this guild, asked Helen what she had come for. The most high-profile incident that happened recently was the assassination attempt on the Emperor, in which the poisoners used a rare poison. Helen reasoned that if the man in front of her was truly the guild leader, he would never miss the information she was about to give him. The girl said that she wanted to sell him some information that would bring a lot of benefit to the guild. Helen reported that this was information about a family that was smuggling a deadly poison called akabana. Lemon was very interested in the information the girl offered him. Helen reported that she not only had reliable information about the smuggler's family, but also a detailed description of the process of distributing the poison. Lemon was pleased that such an informed guest had come to him and was ready to make a mutually beneficial deal with the girl. Akban was a poison that had neither color nor smell. It was difficult to detect, and only a lucky chance helped the Emperor avoid poisoning. If Helen's guess was correct, then the Imperial Bloodhounds are secretly investigating the case of those who grow and smuggle Akaban. Lemon asked Helen what her conditions were, where she wanted to transfer this information, if it was genuine, of course. The girl stated that she wanted this information to be passed on to the commander of the First Sacred Knightly Order, Eden Aquilium, on behalf of the guild. Helen was moderate. At this point, the family involved in the Akabana smuggling would look like the main suspect in the poisoning case. Although, according to Helen's recollections of the plot of the original novel, the assassination attempt on the Emperor was organized by the temple. At first, the clergy held strong power in the Empire, but several years ago the balance of power began to shift, and the temple sought to prevent the growth of imperial influence. In order to weaken the imperial power, it was proposed to first poison the Emperor and then heal him with holy power. The operation was carried out in conditions of the utmost secrecy, with one of the families tasked with smuggling the Akaban. The temple then staged a show of arresting influential people allegedly connected to the crime, and further strengthened its position. The commander of the First Sacred Knightly Order, Eden Aquilium, was assigned to investigate the case. According to the novel's plot, the smuggler's family will be arrested only a year from now, but Helen couldn't wait that long. Anna had to be dealt with quickly. At the same time, Helen understood perfectly well that the temple servants would try to find her and take revenge, since it was she who provided information about them. It was for this reason that the Information Guild had to become the girl's shield. Lemon just puffed and sighed, listening to everything that this incredibly young but very smart person told him. As a result, the man laughed right in her face. It was incredible that the girl was telling him reliable information. Lemon asked how she could have known that everything she said was classified as top secret, and the investigator's identity was known to only a very small circle of people. Helen was glad that at least they believed her here, although Lemon decided to add one more condition to their agreement. Helen intended to continue using the guild's services, and therefore decided to offer Lemon a bet instead of a condition. The girl announced that over the next 3 months, the first person to reveal the identity of the other would win. Lemon replied that if it was a bet, he must have a prize, and before he agreed, he wanted to know what it was. Helen replied that as a prize, she would leave behind the information that Mr. Lemon desired to possess more than anything else in the world. Lemon became interested in what Helen herself would get in that case. He didn't want to promise the impossible. Helen replied that he could be calm about this, but he would only find out when the bet ended. But he himself would receive that very information. Lemon suggested a password to be given when one of them revealed the other's identity, the words being the Butterfly of Fate. Helen knew that the Butterfly of Fate was one of the common myths of the Empire. Long ago, the Empire was divided into 2 tribes that were constantly at war with each other. One of the latest conflicts dragged on, and then the exhausted people asked God to determine the winner. At that very moment, a butterfly appeared. It chose the winner, and the tribe that was not chosen eventually died out. Later, that butterfly began to be called the Butterfly of Fate, and the winner was said to be chosen by the Butterfly of Fate, which at the same time meant that the one who was not chosen would die. Helen assumed that Lemon had chosen these words as a password to warn her of the possible consequences. But how could you scare a person who was already in danger of death? Helen smiled and agreed to this password. Lemon was curious to see which of them the Butterfly of Fate would choose as the winner, and he said goodbye to his guest until the next meeting. Helen left the guild leader's office and sighed with relief. She had been nervous, first afraid that they wouldn't believe her, then that they would expose her. Helen remembered that when the main character of the novel was here, she found a precious treasure. Helen became curious whether it was still there, or whether someone had already taken it. She walked up to the table with various trinkets and began to examine them carefully. The girl quickly found what she was looking for. It was a seemingly inconspicuous ring that actually had interesting properties. The ring eased the headache. Helen doubted it would work on Cardienne, but it was worth a try. Helen approached the clerk and asked if she could buy the ring. The young man smiled and said that she could simply take the ring and consider it a gift from the master. Helen felt a little uneasy, since it was a gift from the guild leader. But you don't look a good gift in the mouth. The girl returned to the mansion, and every time she drove up to it, she was amazed at how beautiful and convenient everything was arranged there. Helen was glad that she had managed to return well before the start of the lesson. She did not want to keep Vincent waiting from the very first lesson. Helen approached the young gentleman's room, knocked on the door, and announced her arrival. A strange sound came from behind the door. Helen could not determine what could be making such sounds. The door opened, and Vincent appeared in the doorway and politely asked Helen to come in. The boy seemed very tense to Helen. She sincerely hoped that Anna had not done anything wrong in her absence yet. The girl looked at the classroom and discovered that it was not just reading, but shining with cleanliness. It seemed that Vincent had been carefully preparing for his first lesson, tidying up his room. The boy said that he wanted to make a good impression on Helen and therefore tried harder than ever. Of course, he was helped, but Vincent did a lot on his own. Helen was touched by the boy's actions and told him that she was happy that he tried so hard to help her. Vincent lowered his head. It seemed that the praise did not please him at all. It was strange. From the child's expression, Helen realized that he wanted to ask something, but was hesitant. Finally, the young gentleman gathered his strength and asked what the teacher thought of him. Helen replied that this was a strange question. Of course, she only thought well of the young gentleman. He was a wonderful child, after all. The boy looked down and asked why then she always addressed him as young master and did not call him by name. Helen realized that she had confused the child because she had behaved sometimes friendly, sometimes formally. From now on, she had to be only formal. Helen bowed and asked the young gentleman for forgiveness for allowing herself to treat him as a friend. There was an immediate reaction. The boy frowned and grabbed the sleeve of the girl's dress. Helen realized that she had found herself in a situation from which she could not find a way out on her own. To her delight, Vincent asked her not to say that. He didn't like it when she called him young master. Helen was surprised that the little boy was really so upset just because of his official title. It turns out that he had come to love Helen much more than she herself realized. The girl apologized to the boy and promised to call him by name as often as possible. But they could only communicate like this in private, and Vincent couldn't understand why. Helen explained that some people might find the familiar relationship between a student and a teacher inappropriate. If Helen behaves informally, people may question her qualifications as a teacher. The boy understood everything and agreed, but as compensation, he asked permission to call the girl Teacher Vaya when they were alone. Vincent announced that he had a special teacher, and therefore he did not want to call her like everyone else. The boy's words brought tears to the girl's eyes, and it wasn't just because the boy's wish was sweet. Vincent had no idea that Helen's father had called her Via as a child, an affectionate nickname her father had given her. Of course, Helen agreed, but warned that they would only communicate in this way alone, and only in an informal setting. And now the lesson needed to begin. At the end of the lesson, Helen checked her student's test paper and was incredibly surprised by the correctness of the answers. The number of lessons that Vincent passed successfully could be counted on one hand, and the level of knowledge and skills was quite high. Helen told Vincent that he had done an excellent job on his test, even much better than she had expected. Vincent was incredibly happy with the praise, asked several times if he had understood the teacher correctly, and calmed down only when Helen stroked his head. The girl was attracted by a strange sound that sounded in the street, and she hurried to the window. At this time, Helen had already parted with her student and was resting in one of the attics of the mansion, with huge windows and soft sofas. In the courtyard of the mansion, Helen saw several armed people, whom she recognized as warriors from the Holy Knights Squad. The girl watched the unexpected visitors to the mansion with interest. An unusually charming man stepped forward. Helen remembered the novel and realized that this brave knight was Eden Aquilium. Like Cardienne, Eden was a minor male character in the novel Everybody Loves Only the Saint. He hid his feelings and protected Celestine. Eden's main rival was Cardienne, but the Merchet Duchy was the only family that did not worship the goddess. Eden was in constant conflict with Cardienne, and in the end, it was the Knights Commander who cut off the Duke's hand when he succumbed to the darkness. Helen watched the Knights Commander and recalled that the readers of the novel were delighted with this Eden, but she herself did not like that scene. There was a knock on the door, and they asked for permission to enter. Helen wasn't expecting anyone, but she gave permission. A footman appeared and announced that the head butler was asking all of the young master's teachers to come to the reception room. Helen hastened to fulfill the butler's request, but Anna arrived at the reception room doors before her. The girls met each other's eyes, and since there was no one else around them, there was no need to show that they liked each other. Anna looked angrily at Helen. She did not respond to the greeting and reasoned that she had no business being here at all. However, Anna decided that it was even better for her. Just recently, her father told her very good news. The Count reported that he had recently managed to establish a special relationship with the temple, and that he would soon send her portrait to Eden, so Anna should behave decently. Anna confidently took hold of the door handle of the reception room. If her father said so, then she could be completely sure of a successful outcome. Anna boldly opened the door and floated through it, feeling like she was practically the mistress of the mansion and mentally promising Helen to punish her for her insolent behavior. Eden did not greet the girls very friendly, but was surprised that the son of Duke Cardienne had 2 teachers. Helen was delighted. She could not even imagine that she would see Eden and Cardienne together so soon. Eden informed the Duke that it was he who had asked the butler to call the young master's tutor, but he had not expected there to be 2 of them at once. Eden said that he had come for the teacher of the heir to the Duke of Cardienne. Anna melted. Her father was right. Eden had definitely come to meet her. She was, of course, devoted to the Duke, but since her father had said so, she would go with Eden for the sake of decency. However, Eden turned to Helen and called her Anna Lever, which surprised the girl immensely. Helen immediately tried to dispel the doubts of the knight's commander. In fact, she was not Anna Lever at all. Anna herself did not let Helen finish. She loudly expressed her indignation at such confusion and declared that this country bumpkin, Helen, was not Anna Lever. Eden explained that he had heard that Anna Lever was incredibly beautiful, and so he thought that this girl was her. Eden's words finally infuriated Anna. The girl screamed that she was Anna Lever and pushed Helen so hard that she couldn't stay on her feet. Helen felt herself falling, and the indecency and inappropriateness of such a situation flashed through her mind. However, the fall did not happen. Strong male hands caught her again. Could it be that Cardienne, like last time, was in the right place at the right time? Helen decided. However, it was not the Duke who was holding her tightly by the shoulders, but the commander of the Holy Knights, and with concern in his voice, he asked if everything was all right with the girl. Helen froze in surprise. She found the strength to thank the knight, but his attention caused confusion in the young teacher. Meanwhile, Eden asked Helen for forgiveness for making an unforgivable mistake. The commander of the knights turned to Anna and asked her to clarify whether she really was that very Anna Lever, the daughter of Count Lever. Anna replied in a voice full of offended dignity that she was Anna Lever. Eden replied in a calm tone that it was good that he ate it and asked the girl to extend both hands to him. Anna gasped with joy. Eden asks to extend her hands to him. This can only happen in one case. The commander of the knights decided to propose to her. Anna was sure, and now he would give her a ring in front of everyone. Of course, Anna thought. The commander of the knights was inferior to the Duke in nobility and wealth. However, if we think about it sensibly, the stable Marquis of Eden is better than the crazy Duke of Cardienne, and there is no need to intrigue for him anymore. He came himself, and with a ring. Anna was happy. Her dreams were coming true. The girl extended both hands towards the commander of the knights and froze in anticipation. Instead of the coveted wedding ring on her finger, Anna received 2 rings on the wrists of both hands. These were handcuffs. Her dreams were shattered. Anna descended to sinful earth and could not understand what was really happening. The commander of the knights reported that Anna Lever would have to proceed to the temple. He was arresting her as a person involved in the assassination attempt on the emperor. Anna objected. Eden was talking nonsense. Where is she, and where is the assassination attempt on the emperor? She is an honest, loyal subject and did not even think about harming his majesty. Eden replied that it had been established that Earl Glenlever, Anna's father, was smuggling the poisonous herb acabana with the aim of preparing poison for the emperor. Anna said that she couldn't believe it. Her father wouldn't be involved in smuggling such a terrible thing. He is a loyal subject of the emperor. Eden asked those present if anyone had seen Lady Anne Lever acting suspiciously. The maid intervened in the conversation and said that there was one incident that had recently greatly puzzled her. It happened quite recently. Anna asked to bring a bag of herbs to Lady Helen's room, saying that it was a sleeping pill. The maid reported that she did not follow Anna's instructions and still had the herbs in her pocket. Helen watched in surprise as the maid handed the knight commander a bag of unknown herbs. The maid said that Anna told her to put it in Teacher Flinton's room and not tell anyone. It seemed strange, and she kept the herb in her room. Anna was indignant. She was hearing about this for the first time. Besides, this maid was Helen's personal servant, so everything could have been set up by Lady Flinton. Helen suggested checking what kind of herb was in the mysterious bag. Maybe this would give a clue to its owner. Anna was seething with anger. She was ready to grab Helen by the hair here and now, but the handcuffs were in her way. The butler intervened and said that he was ready to test the contents of the bag on himself. Winston poured some of the contents onto his hand. They were dry herbal leaves, very similar to tea leaves. The butler carefully brought the leaves to his face and sniffed. The grass had no scent. Winston reported that, judging by the fact that there was no smell coming from the leaves, they were ordinary tea leaves. Anna was delighted with the support, and again began to assert that she knew nothing about poisonous herbs in general, and acaban in particular. Helen remarked that the tea leaves were odorless. This was very strange. Tea leaves have their own characteristic smell. Winston agreed with her. Helen thought that these leaves were the poison, and she needed to push Eden to make the right decision. Helen said that she knew that acaban had no taste or smell. The herb became harmful. When in contact with hot water, Eden asked to bring a cup and hot water. Anna was worried. Eden had apparently guessed everything, and now she would definitely be exposed. The maid quickly brought a cup and boiling water, and the leaves were brewed in the hot water. Eden, as an expert in various poisons, decided to test what the resulting infusion was like. The Knight's commander took a sip of the drink, and his eyes widened in surprise and indignation. Eden's hands trembled. He felt unwell and dropped the cup with the drink on the floor. It shattered into pieces. The Knight commander felt like he was suffocating, a clear symptom of poisoning by the Akabana poison. The butler shouted for a doctor to be called immediately, but Eden declared that he was perfectly fine. Eden declared that it was definitely the deadly poison of the Akabana. All the symptoms pointed to it. Helen saw a blue aura surrounding Eden. She assumed it was divine power, and when it appeared, the symptoms of poisoning disappeared. Cardian clarified that if it is Akaban, then it is the most devilish herb, and it cannot be detected with silver, and there is no antidote for it. Helen remembered that in the novel it was written that the sedative herb that Cardian smoked was a poisonous herb similar to Akaban, so she knows everything. Eden explained that this is what most people think of Akabana, but in fact there is something new. Only recently, the temple discovered that the poison of the Akabana can be neutralized with divine power. Eden turned to Anna and asked whether, in light of the new circumstances, she intended to admit her guilt, or whether she planned to continue denying everything. Anna categorically denied her guilt and claimed that she had no idea what it was. The Knight commander clarified that she admits that this pouch belongs to her. The knights summoned by Eden surrounded Anna and informed her that since she had kept and was going to use the Akaban, she would not escape punishment. Anna was taken away. She screamed that she was innocent and asked the Duke to blunt his sword for her. The door slammed behind Anna and the knights. Helen expected Anna to be arrested, but she didn't think it would happen so quickly. The butler and the maid hurried to take their leave. They needed to collect Anna's things and send them after her. Helen was afraid that if the butler and the maid left, she would be left alone with Duke Cardian and Eden. The servant quickly disappeared behind the door, and Helen stood there for a while, carefully watching both men. The girl thought that the looks of these guys might give her indigestion, and she needed to rest, so she asked out loud for permission to leave. Eden stopped Helen. It seemed to him that the girl looked bad and offered to examine her. Eden's answer came from Cardian. The Duke abruptly stated that Eden's services as his son's governess were not needed. Eden was puzzled by Cardian's abrupt refusal and asked what it meant and why he was speaking on behalf of Lady Helen. Helen watched the men and realized that their relationship was even worse than she could have imagined. The temple and the Merchetti's house were known for their hostility, but Helen did not think that it was real hatred and absolute dislike. The feud began with Cardian's hatred of the temple and all its servants, and the temple disliked the Merchettis as the only family that did not worship the goddess. Eden and Cardian didn't have mutual respect and trust from the start, and without it, the gap between them constantly grew. Helen was very interested in why Cardian hated the temple so much. Nothing was said about this in the novel. Duke Cardian took Lady Helen by the hand and forced her to hide behind his back without asking her opinion. Helen suddenly heard that Cardian couldn't stand it when other people's hands touched his property. The Duke told Eden that he was on the territory of the Merchet's house. Everything here belonged to Cardian, and his heir's tutor was no exception. The Duke's hand fell on the girl's shoulder, demonstrating both protection and possessiveness. Cardian declared that Eden should not dare touch Lady Helen. His menacing appearance did not promise anything good to anyone who challenged his rights. Helen was torn between whether to be happy or outraged upon hearing such a statement from the main villain of this novel. The walls of the Dukes of Merchetti's mansion have never heard its current owner, Cardian, so openly declare his rights to any woman. Helen was puzzled why Cardian was showing interest in her. He didn't even pay much attention to his own son, Vincent. Eden decided not to be rude, and the Knight Commander apologized for his harshness. The man explained that he had not wanted to scare the sweet lady at all, but wanted to help her. Eden asked Duke Cardian for permission to say goodbye to the lady before leaving. The Knight's commander told the girl that thanks to her active assistance, evidence of Akabana smuggling had been found. As the commander of the First Sacred Knightly Order, Eden promised Helen that he would one day repay her for the service she had rendered to the temple, so it was important for him to know her name. Being under the protection of Duke Cardian, Helen actually felt much more confident. Now she could observe the behavior of the Knight of the Temple of Eden much more calmly and draw conclusions. The girl decided that Eden was as honest a person as described in the original. However, Helen knew for sure that she had no reason to get involved with the temple and replied that she had only done what she had to do as a tutor in the Merchetti's house. The girl realized that Eden was unaware that the Akabane was being spread by the temple itself. Apparently, there was another coalition within the temple opposing the emperor's power. Helen replied that Eden didn't need to do anything to repay her for her actions, and thought to herself that now was the time to keep a low profile and sit quietly. The girl asked if the gentleman had any other business with her. If not, then she would probably take her leave and quickly left the room. Eden was puzzled. No woman had ever looked at him with such icy coldness and indifference. Cardian added that if the knight commander had no more business on the territory of his mansion, then Eden and his knights should leave immediately. The Duke declared that he did not dare to detain the holy knights of the temple and wished to see them off as quickly as possible. Eden could have explained a lot to Cardian, but the Duke did not trust him and did not want to communicate with him. The next day was just as sunny and beautiful, and Helen began to suspect that the Duke had a magician in his employ who was an expert in weather magic. Butler Winston called Lady Helen into the reception room and thanked her for what she had done yesterday. The butler believed that if she had not insisted on checking the tea leaves, the Merchet Duchy would have been drawn into trouble. Helen replied that she was always ready to defend the honor of her employer, and that the main thing was that no one was hurt. After all, this was a very important matter for the entire empire. The assassination attempt on His Majesty needed to be investigated and the enemies identified. If Eden hadn't found a way to confirm that the poison belonged to Anna, it would have been difficult for the Merchetti's family to avoid trouble. If everything was so great, Helen decided, then it was time to remember the special clause in the contract. Helen reminded Winston of the special clause she had written into the contract when she drew it up. This was a clause that if the current tutor was fired, no new one would be hired for the next year. The butler remembered that Helen had stated that since Anna could not continue her studies, from now on, she would be responsible for conducting all of the young master's lessons herself. Winston, contrary to Helen's fears, was delighted by her statement. It made him feel much calmer. The man stated that a teacher like her could be trusted to raise an heir. He would not interfere with her studies, and she could plan them as she wished. Helen was delighted. Now she would have more opportunities and freedom of action. The butler added that Mr. Cardian asked Helen to report on Vincent's progress several times a week in his office. This news was unexpected and not very pleasant for the girl. Periodically meeting with the Duke was not part of her plans. As she pondered Winston's message during breakfast with Vincent, Helen decided that while meeting Cardian frequently was a problem, it wasn't all bad. Helen was pleased that the weather was good. The problem with Anna was solved, and she was able to establish friendly relations with Vincent. The boy has completely calmed down, trusts Helen, and is now gobbling up his breakfast with great appetite. Helen asked Vincent if he thought today's breakfast was tasty, and the boy replied that he liked it very much. Helen was pleased that Anna, who had driven a wedge between Cardian and Vincent, had disappeared. Now this child would not commit parricide. Anna could have caused a quarrel between Vincent and Cardian only because the boy was not the Duke's biological son. His real father was the Duke's older brother. Cardian Mercedes was illegitimate, suffered from fever, and was despised even by his own parents. The only one who accepted Cardian and considered him a member of the Seven was his half-brother. It was he who found a way to alleviate Cardian's condition. It was not a panacea, but it made the boy's life easier. One day, Cardian's brother brought him a pipe and some grass to fill it with. Everything was going well, but the day after the inheritance of the ducal title, Cardian's brother suddenly disappeared, leaving a document transferring the title to Cardian. The Duke's seat could not remain empty, so Cardian agreed to take on the burden of the title. The newly minted Duke was overcome with grief over his lost brother. He could not live without a family at all. Very soon after accepting the title, Cardian brought 3-year-old Vincent to the estate. Helen watched the boy and decided to ask if he remembered anything from the time when he was brought to the mansion. Vincent continued to eat his breakfast with pleasure, but immediately responded to Helen's call. The girl asked permission to ask the boy something, but if he didn't want to answer, she wouldn't insist. Vincent was taken aback by the teacher's question. Helen asked what he thought of His Grace the Duke of Cardian. The boy shrugged and said, as if by rote, that he thought the Duke was a good man. Suddenly, the boy perked up and said that only the Duke had taken him in and taken care of him, so he wanted to study well, but he was not doing well. Helen was perplexed. There was no logic in the boy's actions. Vincent had recently been refusing to attend lessons and hiding. Of course, Vincent knew that his reputation affected Cardien's reputation, but he was too young to handle all this alone. Helen assured the boy that from that moment on, everything would be completely fine, and that she would definitely help him. Vincent believed his teacher and hoped that now everything would work out for him. Helen hoped that eliminating the factors that pushed the boy to hatred and murder would avoid the events described in the novel. It was not in Helen's interests to adhere to the original plot, otherwise she would not be able to obtain the family treasure. In any case, she had only one way out. She needed to win the favor of Duke Cardien and gain his trust. Helen knocked on the door of Duke Cardien's office for a long time, but no one answered. The girl had already decided that Cardien didn't want to answer her, because she knew for sure that he was in his room. There was another reason why the Duke did not want to show himself to people in general, and to Helen in particular. This reason was closely related to Cardien's health and magical abilities. It was quite possible that the Duke was having a fit of magical rage. Helen knocked insistently on the door and loudly asked if the Duke was in the office. The door opened slightly. Helen sighed with relief. He was probably busy with something important, which is why he was slow in answering. Suddenly, Duke Cardien's hand came out of the doorway and grabbed Helen by the shoulder. The girl didn't even have time to squeak out anything coherent before Cardien grabbed her by the shoulder and pulled her into the room. Helen obeyed in surprise. Everything happened too quickly for her to be able to react to it in any way. The door slammed shut behind Helen, sealing off Duke Cardien and his secrets from the other inhabitants of the mansion. Helen found herself in a darkened room, her back pressed against the door and staring straight into the face of her employer. Duke Cardien's face, as usual, was incredibly pale and expressionless. The man was looming over her, leaning against the doorframe, but it seemed like he wasn't fully aware of his actions. From the novel, Helen remembered that Cardien could not control his magical rage and suffered from unimaginable pain and nightmares that haunted him. Judging by the fact that he was moving, the Duke was most likely struggling with the magic that was trying to consume him. Helen decided that she had to help him. An ordinary person would be crushed by out-of-control magic, but Helen was able to control dreams. Helen believed that she would be able to destroy Cardien's nightmare and bring the Duke out of his trance. The girl extended her hand to the man's face and immediately felt it radiate a warm light. Helen concentrated her forces and directed the flow towards the Duke. But then she felt something strange. This had never happened before. The light grew stronger, and Helen felt herself being drawn into it completely. If anyone had looked at the Duke's office window at that moment, they would have seen a silvery white glow growing ever brighter. Helen found herself in a strange place. The glow still continued to blind her, but very soon it disappeared. The girl looked around. She was either in the basement of a stone building or in the dark corridor of a not particularly cozy house. It was dark and damp here. Helen was overcome with fear. Had her abilities failed her? Had something gone wrong? Where did Duke Cardien himself go? Helen's ability behaved strangely when it came into contact with the Duke's furious magic. From around the corner of the corridor, 3 monks came out to meet the girl. Judging by their attire, they belonged to the temple of the goddess. Helen was afraid of who these people were and what they would do if they found an uninvited guest here, whether they would believe her story or kill her without listening. The monks were walking straight towards her. Helen had nowhere to hide, and she prepared herself for the worst outcome. The girl closed her eyes in fear and suddenly discovered that the monks had passed through her, as if Helen had not been there at all. This turn of events did not upset Helen very much. Questions arose, of course, but she no longer feared for her life. The girl looked at her hands. There was nothing unusual about them, but for the people living in this place, she was most likely invisible. Helen assumed that her ability had activated before she lost consciousness, and that she was now inside a dream. Doubts were dispelled, that's how it was. Helen had no doubt that the owner of this dream was Duke Cardien. She followed the monks and, to confirm her thoughts, saw a boy kneeling, about 10 years old, maybe a little older. The child was unfamiliar to Helen, but by the characteristic features of his face, she quickly recognized him as the Duke of Cardien in childhood. From behind the monks' backs, Helen saw what and how these people were doing to the child. The cruelty of the ritual was outrageous, but she was a phantom and could not interfere. The monks were talking, and Helen learned that the ritual was almost finished. The effect on the child was being carried out for the last time today. A self-confident guy in a white hood announced that if the ritual was successful, they would receive an obedient doll called Mercedes. Helen saw the pattern on the speaker's back and realized that he belonged to the highest hierarchy of monks of the ancient temple. While studying books on archaeology at the academy, Helen accidentally came across a description of the signs of the temple hierarchy. This was hidden information. It was unclear why the monks of the Temple of the White Goddess were doing this to Cardienne. Helen heard the senior monk tell another that if the ritual was successful, the boy could be returned to Mercedes, but if it failed, he could simply be disposed of. The monks began the final stage of the ritual, and the victim of their experiments experienced incredible torment. Helen witnessed Cardienne scream in pain and arch his back. The girl screamed for the monks to stop abusing the child. He could die, but no one heard her. Helen couldn't decide what to do to stop the child's suffering. Obeying some inner impulse, Helen rushed to the child writhing in agony and shielded him from the effects of harmful magic. Helen carefully covered the child, but in doing so, she exposed herself to the streams of magic that brought pain and degradation. Helen realized that on the day they met in the library, and on other days, Cardienne had seen exactly the same nightmare and was experiencing excruciating pain. The boy felt relieved, tried to free himself from Helen's arms, and asked who she was and where she came from. Helen felt that she was touching the child's body and feeling it, but it was only a dream. The girl realized that the little boy Cardienne saw her. At that moment, a spark of hope flashed in his eyes, and Helen fell into despair. These were memories that she could not interfere with, and Helen would not be able to save him. She was powerless and disappointed. Perhaps Helen had been too self-confident all this time. The ease with which she had achieved everything lately had made her head spin. The girl thought that with her ability to control dreams, she could save Duke Cardienne from his obsessive nightmares at any moment. Helen began to cry and ask forgiveness from the boy standing in front of her. She asked forgiveness for the fact that she could not help and could not save. Suddenly, the child looked at her with gratitude and said that everything was fine and that no matter what she cried. Helen hugged the boy again, and the same wonderful silver light began to flare up between them. It grew brighter and brighter until it consumed them both. Helen felt the light getting out of control again, and she was being sucked somewhere again. But she hadn't saved Cardienne yet. Helen felt that she was being carried away somewhere again, and the small, unhappy, exhausted child was left alone in a terrible and evil place. The next moment, Helen found herself lying on the floor in Duke Cardienne's office. It was getting dark, and the rays of the setting sun were shining through the window. Helen realized that she had returned to reality. It seemed to her that she had spent a few minutes there, but in fact much more time had passed. The girl remembered Cardienne, and anxiety returned to her. What was wrong with him? How did he endure all this? The man was lying next to her, right there on the floor. His eyes were tightly closed. At least he looked like a normal person. It remained to be seen how he felt, and whether he remembered what happened to them in the dream. Helen moved closer to the Duke. She felt his even breathing and realized that his raging magic had subsided. The girl decided that if the Duke remembered her in his dream, he might suspect something, and therefore decided that it would be better for him to forget this dream. Helen extended her hand to Cardienne and suggested to him that he forget this terrible and painful dream. The girl sincerely hoped that her actions would at least help Cardienne a little to get rid of the terrible memories. Helen decided it was time to call the head butler, Winston, as she herself would not be able to carry the Duke to bed. Helen didn't manage to get far. Duke Cardienne stopped her, catching her hand. The girl let out a quiet cry of surprise, and she didn't even understand when Cardienne managed to come to his senses. Helen was embarrassed. The Duke's gaze followed her intently. It was alarming. Suddenly, he remembered everything. The girl said hello, and without a moment's hesitation, began to explain her appearance in his office. Helen was afraid that the Duke would misunderstand her behavior, and said that she had come to report on how the young master's training was progressing. Helen said that she knocked for a long time, but he did not answer then. She decided to look into the office, and he was lying there unconscious. The girl said that she simply stayed nearby until his lordship came to his senses. She had no other intentions. Cardienne abruptly interrupted Helen's explanations. He rose to his feet and tidied himself up. Judging by his reaction to Helen's words, the girl understood only one thing that brought her relief. Cardienne didn't remember anything, neither that his magic had gone out of control, nor that Helen had looked into his dream. Whatever he dreamed about, the master of the dream was undoubtedly young Cardienne. It was him that Helen saw in the center of the circle. People with the symbols of the ancient temple were clearly casting some kind of heavy spell on the boy. Helen clearly remembered that this was not in the original, which meant that Cardian carefully hid everything connected with the ancient temple. The girl began to fear that she might be expelled from the duchy for poking her nose into this dream, and then it would be difficult for her to get to the Merchet relic. Helen noticed the deathly pale face of Duke Cardian, which was probably a consequence of the magical emission. The girl remembered that in the original novel, it was described that Cardian was always exhausted after a magical emission. Helen really wanted to help the Duke, but she couldn't figure out how to do it. Then, Helen remembered the find in the pawn shop, and she said that she had a small gift for the Duke. The girl extended her palm to the Duke. On it lay a small and very cheap ring. Cardian was slightly shocked that she could give him an old, worn ring that belonged in the jewelry scrap bin. Helen was horrified by his disgusting manners. But what can you expect from him, a villain? The girl explained that this ring has a special power. If you put it on your finger, the girl explained, then this will happen. Helen asked the Duke to extend his hand to her. The girl felt a thrill and a pang, apparently because she saw a smaller version of him. The Duke no longer seemed as unapproachable to her as before. Helen carefully put the ring on the Duke's finger. The girl timidly asked him if he liked the ring and how it made him feel. Edwin looked closely at his hand, at the ring on his ring finger, and his face reflected bewilderment. It was clear that the ring did not arouse any emotional awe or interest in the Duke, and that he considered it an abomination. Helen asked if Edwin's mood had improved, or if his head had cleared, what the Duke was feeling. The Duke listened to himself, his head cleared up, and his mood improved. However, the Duke believed that his condition improved not because of the ring, but because of Helen's teacher. This is exactly what he told the girl. The Duke did not explain anything and was laconic. Because of this, Helen became even more anxious. The girl was afraid that Duke Cardian might figure out her essence and guess her abilities. Duke Cardian explained that when he touched Helen, his head became clear, and his headache went away. Helen wondered which time exactly the Duke considered the past. Perhaps the one when he picked her up in the hall of the mansion. Cardian demanded that Helen reveal her secret to him and admit who she really was. The girl found herself at a crossroads, whether to confess or hide everything, whether it was a dangerous situation or an opportunity to achieve what she wanted. In the novel, the Duke found relief from pain by being near Saint Celestine Cardian. Helen couldn't pinpoint the exact reason, but it seemed like her ability was having a similar effect on Cardian. Helen decided to use this for negotiations. She was glad that the Duke guessed and said that her ability could really help him. Cardian asked what kind of rare ability Helen had, and the girl replied that it was difficult to explain it to her exactly, but if he allowed her, she could help him. Helen will help Cardian only on one condition. Let the Duke immediately swear that he will fulfill it. Cardian was stunned by the impudence of this strange woman, who had somehow ended up in his office. Cardian smiled nervously and asked Helen if she was completely crazy to set conditions for him. This fearless girl attracted him more and more. It was a pity that he couldn't have a light affair with her. Cardian asked if Helen didn't know that he could simply bind her to himself if he wanted, and no negotiations would be necessary. The Duke asked if the teacher was not afraid of him at all, and what about his reputation then, or if she had heard little about his bad character. Helen felt his pressure on her, but if Cardian was really as cruel as they said, he would have been keeping Celestine by force by now. With his magic, money, and connections, he could keep anyone close to him with absolute impunity, especially a weak woman. Duke Cardian, according to the novel's content, when he loved Celestine, only persistently courted the girl, without trying to force her into a relationship. Helen identified the Duke's behavior today as a desire to protect himself and push him away before he was hurt again. Helen understood Cardian perfectly, because in the recent past, she had been just as distrustful and knew very well what kind of pain it was. Cardian had been kicked in the gut so many times by people he trusted that it was no surprise that he was determined not to get into close relationships with strangers. So Helen gently touched the formidable Duke's cheek and smiled at him, hoping she looked kind and not frightened. The girl said that she was not afraid of Cardian at all. He was not as scary and menacing as he seemed at first glance. Cardian froze. The touch of this woman caused him strange sensations. He felt light and calm. His head stopped hurting for a moment. The Duke was surprised by Helen's words. He decided that she was a strange woman. In any case, her reaction was different from what he usually saw. Helen sighed. Not that she was scared, but still she was tense when communicating with the Duke, especially such a close one. The Duke took his favorite chair and asked what condition Helen's teacher wanted to discuss. The girl replied that she knew about the illness that His Excellency was suffering from. It was not madness, but a magical discharge. She suspects that over time, his magical emissions will become stronger, and the effect of the sedative herb will weaken. The Duke's nightmares will become more and more terrible. It will become increasingly difficult for him to distinguish between sleep and reality, and eventually, Cardienne will go mad. Helen assured him that she could help the Duke cope with this misfortune and not go crazy. Cardienne asked what she wanted for it. The girl replied that she wanted quite a lot for this. She needed a family heirloom of the Merchetti's duchy. She needed to use it just once. Of course, Helen doesn't ask to give her the artifact now. She will help Cardienne for a year, after which he will allow her to use the relic once. Cardienne couldn't hide his regret. But Helen must know that the family heirloom of the Merchetti duchy had long been lost. Helen couldn't hide her state of shock. But this couldn't and shouldn't happen. The Merchette's relic was not only a symbol of the family, but also a sign demonstrating the power of the head of the family. How could such a treasure be lost? Cardienne explained that the artifact had been taken by the previous head of the family. His older brother had disappeared along with it, and a search was underway, but to no avail. Helen realized that in this case, Cardienne, as an illegitimate child and suffering from madness, could not be the rightful head of the family, and his position was precarious. Helen felt sympathy for the Duke. The circumstances were clearly against him, but he held on and did not show that he was surrounded by problems. Cardienne assumed that teacher Helen was very disappointed, since she only got closer to him for the sake of using the relic. Now that the teacher has learned that the artifact is lost, she will most likely leave this house. Helen stated that she is not going to leave, and there are many reasons for this that she cannot explain now. Duke Cardienne was surprised by Helen's statement. This woman was surprising him more and more with her behavior. Helen couldn't leave and abandoned Cardienne and Vincent. She saw the other side of the Duke and watched Vincent, and now she couldn't watch them die. The girl decided to do everything possible to change the future predetermined for them, and it would be easier to track down the relic if she was here. Cardienne liked the girl's determination, and he also began to understand that he didn't want to let her go. The Duke hastened to inform Helen that the relic was being searched for, and his goal was to return the artifact as soon as possible. Cardienne declared that he would definitely find the relic. He simply had no other choice. The Duke accepted Helen's offer, and for a year she helps him, relieving his headaches and banishing nightmares, and after this time, he will ensure the use of the artifact. Helen was delighted. This was a good chance for salvation. The girl sincerely thanked the Duke for the opportunity provided. Helen happened to glance at her watch and saw that it showed just past 6 o'clock. It was late, and the girl asked permission to leave. Before leaving, Helen advised the Duke not to take off the ring. It should show itself, but not immediately. If his lordship finds it difficult to sleep at night, despite the presence of the ring, he must call her for help, the girl demanded. Helen smiled and said with conviction that she could have a positive effect on Cardienne's sleep. The girl curtsied before the Duke, wished him good evening, and said goodbye until the next time. The door closed behind the amazing guest, and Duke Cardienne was left alone with his thoughts. His lordship could not understand before why Vincent liked the teacher Helen so much, but after talking with the girl for a little while, he understood his son perfectly. Teacher Helen made a good impression on the Duke. She knew how to respect other people's boundaries, but at the same time did not allow hers to be violated. A few days later, when evening had fallen on the Merchette mansion and the stars were already lit, the Duke invited Helen to his place. Helen walked and thought that although she herself had suggested inviting her, she thought that the Duke would not decide on this anytime soon. Such was his stubborn character. Sitting next to his lordship's bed, Helen never thought that she would be called so soon. The door to the Duke's bedroom was ajar, and the girl knew perfectly well that they were being watched. On the other side of the door, in the corridor, were the butler William and Helen's personal maid, Miss Chelsea. The butler found it suspicious that Helen had been invited into his lordship's bedroom, and at such a late hour. William decided that there was something between the teacher, Helen, and Duke Cardienne, and this thought pleased the butler. William was sure there was something going on that he and Chelsea didn't know about. He thought they looked good, but he didn't expect their relationship to develop so quickly. Chelsea assumed it might have something to do with Vincent, but the butler was convinced otherwise. The old servant really wanted a new wind to blow in the Merchette duchy, and a new mistress to come who could make both Merchets happy. His lordship's happiness meant a calm and blessed life for his servants, so the butler was more interested in this than anyone else. Helen sat down next to the Duke, who wanted to sleep, and asked what she could do to ease his condition. Cardian asked the girl to simply sit next to his bed. There was absolutely no need to do anything. Helen rightly assumed that Cardian didn't know about her abilities, so she could really only be around him. The girl thought that her presence here was pointless, although she was not absolutely sure of it. Cardian was not known for his many words, and so when he said the word book, Helen did not understand his request. The Duke had to explain that there was a book in the drawer of the bedside table. The girl hurried to fulfill the Duke's wish and find the desired book. It turned out that it was also familiar to Helen. Cardian asked how she knew this book. The girl answered that her father gave her this book, and it has great meaning for her. After her father's death, Helen explained, creditors even took the books. She tried to find it, but the traces were lost, and suddenly the book was discovered in the Duke's library. Helen said she was incredibly happy to have found this book. She considered it a good sign. While talking about how pleased she was with her unexpected find, Helen noticed that the Duke was watching her closely. Cardian sighed and said that he envied Helen. It must be nice to have such memories of a parent. Helen did not expect that her emotionality would have exactly this effect on the Duke. At first, Cardian reacted sharply to her presence, and the girl did not think that one day he would say something like that to her. It was quite possible that Cardian was sincere, but the words were not spoken entirely consciously. Perhaps she would find something that would console the Duke. Helen said she was glad that the Duke understood her. He also had dear people. It couldn't be that way. The girl reminded that Vincent, the butler, and other members of the Merchet family live in this mansion, and they are probably dear to his lordship. Perhaps the Duke should forget the problems of the distant past, the girl suggested, and start creating memories from this moment. His lordship has a long and happy life ahead of him, and Helen is ready to help him if the Duke doesn't mind. Cardian Mercedes looked intently at Helen. This woman spoke strange words, but they revived in him hope for a better future. The Duke smiled and said that Helen was an amazing woman, and he was becoming more and more convinced of this. Helen saw that the Duke was getting sleepy. She said that she would not disturb him with her chatter, and he should try to fall asleep. The girl promised not to go anywhere and to stay next to his lordship until he fell completely asleep. The morning was clear and bright, promising that the day would be wonderful and bring only good news. Butler Winston appeared at the door of the Duke's bedroom with the documents that his lordship had asked him to prepare yesterday. From the butler's point of view, Cardian did not look like his usual self today. It seemed as if the Duke had just woken up, and the reason for his awakening was Winston's appearance. The butler assumed that the gentleman had been sleeping until that time, but this was too unusual to be true. Cardian looked confused and asked the butler what time it was. At this time, Helen was busy with her direct duties. She taught Vincent. The boy was obedient and attentive. The girl wondered if she should have stayed in the Duke's bedroom longer. Due to preparations for the lesson, she left as soon as Cardian fell asleep. The girl was distracted from her thoughts about the Duke by Vincent, and the boy happily informed the teacher that he had solved everything she had asked. Helen took the worksheet from the boy and began checking his work. As Helen progressed through the student's work, she became more and more surprised. The progress was obvious and rapid. Everything was decided correctly, although yesterday the boy did not fully understand the material, and she decided to explain everything a little later when he had mastered the basics. Even if Vincent listens to her attentively, he still couldn't have made that much progress in just one lesson. This meant only one thing. The guy was doing a lot of work on his own, and it couldn't be otherwise. Helen praised the boy for completing the task brilliantly and asked if he had studied independently yesterday. Vincent was confused and fell silent. Apparently, he did not know what to say and was afraid that the teacher would be angry with him. Helen was delighted. It turned out that the reason Vincent never lagged behind in class was his independent, secret studies. Until this moment, Helen had looked at Vincent as if he were a character from a novel, and she felt ashamed of her thought that the boy would not study hard. It occurred to Helen that both characters in the novel, Vincent and Cardian, were now significantly different from how she knew them from the novel. The girl did not suspect that it would be exactly like this, and therefore she was mistaken about Vincent. Helen decided that she was a bad teacher since she allowed such thoughts. The girl felt sorry for Vincent. The guy tried hard and deserved encouragement and praise. Helen stroked the boy's head, ruffling his hair. He really did look younger, as he had figured out the topic almost on his own. Helen decided to be a good teacher and asked Vincent what he would like to receive as a reward for his efforts. Vincent asked again if it was true that he could wish for anything. In fact, there was nothing he wanted to get, but there was something he wanted to do. The boy was afraid that he would be refused, so he closed his eyes and almost shouted that he wanted to go to the festival with Teacher Via. For Helen, this desire of the boy was a complete surprise, although one could have guessed that the guy lived in abundance, but he had problems with entertainment. Vincent took the teacher's confusion for a refusal. He had not expected a positive answer. The boy became sad, but he also justified the teacher. She shouldn't overexert herself. He was ready to give up this desire and think of something else for next time. Helen was not against the walk, but she had no right to decide such things on her own. But Vincent's unhappy appearance made her be more decisive. The girl said that they would go to the festival since Vincent wanted it. It was a completely trivial request. The child's joy knew no bounds. Helen realized that promising the child a walk without coordinating it with his adoptive father was a big mistake, but she could not do otherwise. It was too late to retreat, and all she could do was convince Cardienne to let her and Vincent go to the festival, but she couldn't even imagine where it would all lead. Fully prepared for their walk, Vincent and Helen were shocked by who they saw next to the carriage, ready to take them to the festival. Duke Cardienne, dressed in one of his best suits, walked impatiently along the carriage. When he saw the teacher and his nephew, he noticed that they were late. Not long before this, Helen came to the Duke's office and demonstrated how Vincent solved the last test. The Duke did not understand why Teacher Helen was showing him this sheet of paper with completed, albeit brilliantly, assignments. Helen explained that it was Vincent's test, Chapter 5 of the Fundamentals of Magic, a difficult topic for a 10-year-old boy. But he got an A. Cardienne asked if Helen really meant to say that his adopted son Vincent was a genius child. The girl explained that the young gentleman was certainly smart, but this was not only the result of his talent. To master the material so well, Vincent had to study on his own until late at night. After classes, Helen told the Duke, and therefore, the girl added, the boy should be rewarded for his efforts, as, by the way, in 3 days there will be a festival, and she and Vincent can go there. The Duke thought about it and agreed to the teacher's proposal, which caused a storm of delight and a stream of gratitude from Helen. Helen did not expect that Duke Cardienne would be so generous, or that he would trust her so much that he would let his heir go for a walk with her. In any case, the girl reasoned, this villain is the best villain in the world. During his next visit to Duke Cardienne, the butler Winston was surprised by the state of his master. He even hummed something to himself. It was the first time Winston had seen the Duke so relaxed, and the butler believed that he should be grateful to his new teacher for this. The butler was incredibly happy for the gentleman. He finally had a woman he liked, and who liked him. Cardienne remarked to the butler that he was too absent-minded today. Winston should stop thinking about extraneous things and concentrate on business. Winston apologized to his lordship and said that he would be more careful in the future. Meanwhile, the butler was incredibly curious whether he was right in his guesses, and what the Duke really thought about the teacher. Winston asked what the gentleman thought of Helen. Personally, she seemed to him a good person, and the young gentleman obeyed her. Did the Duke agree with the butler? The butler laughed. The young gentleman listens only to Teacher Flinton. Winston sometimes feels a little offended that he himself could not find an approach to the child. The young master continues to react with hostility to the butler and other inhabitants of the mansion. Cardienne looked up from his papers and thought for a moment. What he asked surprised Winston. His lordship asked the butler's opinion on whether the teacher could be trusted. The butler was shocked. Did the Duke really not trust Helen? Winston declared that he could trust her completely. The teacher not only deflected suspicion of betrayal from the family, but also, keeping the secret, remained close to Vincent. The butler was surprised that his lordship could not trust such a wonderful woman as Teacher Flinton. Cardienne replied that he had reasons not to believe her. She was clearly not being completely frank with him. The Duke told Winston that he had recently had a burst of magic, and when he came to, Teacher Flinton was next to him. Winston was surprised when the Duke had a surge of power. Everything around him was destroyed. But this time, the butler did not notice any signs of destruction in the mansion. Cardienne confirmed that the teacher was safe and sound, and that the nightmare the Duke sees with every emission had not occurred to him that day. The Duke understood that Helen Flinton was not quite an ordinary home teacher, and the butler asked what the gentleman was going to do with the girl. Cardian replied that so far there was nothing. There was no harm from it, only benefit so far, so we'll wait and see. Nothing has changed in the library. The same silence, cleanliness, and austerity. Helen came here to find out what was going on and how to behave properly at the local festival. Her personal maid and best friend Chelsea was not at the mansion, so she asked for a day off. Butler Winston was not the sort of man to enjoy festivals. There was clearly no point in asking Duke Cardian himself about something like that. Therefore, Helen was at a loss. The only source of information for her could be the library. The girl hoped to glean the necessary information from some newspapers or magazines, and at the same time question Ravon. Helen wandered through the library corridors for a long time, but the caretaker was nowhere to be seen. Without him, the girl could not find anything. While waiting for Ravon to return, Helen decided to explore the library. She had long been interested in details about the history of the temple. Helen quickly found a shelf with materials about the temple. They said that the Merchet's library was larger than the imperial one, which meant there was more information here. The girl decided to carefully study all the information available in the library about the ancient temple. The thing is that in the novel that Helen read in her past life, there was very little information about the temple. The girl understood that what the monks were influencing the Duke with was an ability similar to divine power. Helen remembered that Cardian, before coming into the Merchetti's family, was a homeless child and lived on the streets. The girl heard in Cardian's dream how the monks said that if the spell worked, they would get their hands on a doll named Merchetti's. How much this was connected with the Duke's nightmare. Besides, Helen was worried about how much this was connected with the death of Cardian. Helen was worried that there was so much she didn't know about Duke Cardian and his connection to the temple, so she couldn't just sit back and do nothing. So the girl decided not to wait for the library caretaker and went to look for information on her own. Helen was hanging around in the library until late at night. The girl didn't notice how time passed. Footsteps were heard in the deserted hall. It was the return of the library caretaker, Ravon. The guy tripped on the stairs and almost fell, but at the last moment he grouped himself and landed without harm. Ravon walked deeper into the building and unexpectedly came across the young master's teacher, Helen Flinton. The girl was fast asleep. The library caretaker was confused as to what this woman was doing there so late and all alone. Around Helen, there were stacks of books related to the ancient temple. Here was the history of the temple, the legends of the temple, the famous monks of the temple. Ravon chuckled. This woman is not sure she is going to become a priestess of the temple, but it was Helen who was being talked about a lot in the mansion lately. It was said that Teacher Flinton helped in solving the crimes of Anna Lever. It was she who made the young duke, who was called the little devil of the Merchet's family, become attached to her. Outwardly, Helen Flinton was a completely ordinary, unremarkable girl, although she was certainly attractive, Ravon decided. In this way, she is so similar to that very woman, the one and only, about whom legends circulated. Ravon smiled, looked at the sleeping girl, and wondered who she really was and how much she knew. Raven watched the sleeping girl and reasoned that she could not know information available only to members of the imperial family. She was an ordinary girl. The guy immediately determined that Helen was terminally ill. He saw the subtle symptoms of flower disease. Raven was actually the master of the Luna Guild, named Lemon. He had all the important and not so important information on the continent. Lemon knew everything about everything, with the exception of the Merchetti's duchy. Lemon knew almost nothing about what was happening in that place. He had no informants here. In order to gain access to information about the events in the Merchet duchy, Lemon personally infiltrated its territory, but was quickly discovered by the Duke's men. Lemon had no choice but to offer help in finding the lost family heirloom. Only thanks to this, he was spared and allowed to remain in the duchy as the keeper of the library. Lemon disguised himself with an artifact and changed the color of his hair and eyes. But instead of being given a favor, he was given a job, and he couldn't neglect his duties. Lemon could have been fired, so the master of the Information Guild found himself in a funny situation and was forced to keep an eye not only on the Duke, but also on his books. Watching Helen, Lemon decided that until he had enough information about her, he needed to be wary and treat her with distrust. Lemon had information about Helen's contact with the commander of the ancient temple knights, Eden Aquilium. The Information Guild master came up with the idea that to get more detailed information about Helen, he needed to dig into the saint's side. Helen woke up, She didn't understand when she managed to fall asleep. Right in front of her stood the librarian, Mr. Raven. The guy looked closely at the waking girl and thought that he would find out all the details gradually. He asked the girl if she had slept well. Helen came to her senses. She had indeed slept quite well. The sun had already set, and she was still in the library, but it was so quiet and calm. Lemon Raven noted that Helen had looked through many books about the temple and was surprised that such a young girl was interested in such a boring topic. Helen replied that the topic was not so boring and apologized for taking the books without the librarian's permission. Raven replied that there was nothing wrong with that. The girl explained that she had looked through all these books, but had not found any information about the patterns that represented the hierarchy of the temple monks. Helen thought that the information was in the secret room, but she herself could not go there, and Raven did not invite her. The girl decided to put this problem off for later. In fact, Helen told Raven, she came here to find him. The girl simply needed to consult with him. Lemon was surprised at how he could help the teacher. Helen said that soon she and Vincent would go to the festival, and she wanted to ask Raven to advise her on which places to visit there. Lemon replied that it was not at all difficult for him, but in exchange she had to tell him everything that would happen to her and Vincent at the festival. Helen was surprised that the librarian was setting such strange conditions for her. It was a little awkward. Helen decided to ask why Raven was so interested in what was happening at the festival. Raven hesitated, pretending to be embarrassed, but in reality he was trying to quickly come up with a plausible reason. Lemon Raven said he lost his family early in life, and since then hasn't been able to bring himself to attend festival festivities, so he wants to at least hear the stories. Helen was filled with compassion for this man. She always sympathized with everyone. Raven pretended to be uncomfortable with how pathetic his request sounded. He was a grown man suffering from childhood trauma. Helen answered that she thought it was normal. The girl thought that Raven was very similar to her in terms of the loss of his family, and the fact that he had not been to any festival since then. Helen's story was the same. The last time she went to the festival with her father was when he was still alive. Helen promised Raven to tell him everything about the holiday when she returned. Lemon Raven decided that Helen had fallen into his trap, and now he could make her his agent, albeit blindly. Overjoyed, Raymond laid out a map in front of Helen and began to tell her everything he knew about the festival and the location of the entertainment venues there. The man guaranteed that he would pass on to Helen all his knowledge on this matter. Helen was delighted and noted that the atmosphere of her communication with Raven had changed. He told her about everything with inspiration and joy. Raven showed the girl where, in his opinion, the most luxurious restaurants with delicious food were located and where to look for a street with shops. The man spoke so quickly and energetically that Helen asked him to stop so she could write everything down in detail. The long-awaited day of the walk arrived. On this day, Helen announced a break in the heir's studies. The girl waited for the young gentleman in the courtyard of the mansion. She tried to dress elegantly and modestly, as befits a governess of a noble family. The boy was late, and Helen decided to give him a little more time, especially since she still had no choice. A joyful child's cry was heard from the entrance to the mansion. It was Vincent running and calling for his teacher. The boy ran as fast as he could and almost knocked down Helen, but she was a tough nut to crack and managed to hold on to herself and the little brat. Helen was surprised by the sudden appearance of her pupil, but she was even more surprised by his appearance. Vincent looked very cute in his new dress suit, the color of which matched Helen's dress. Helen asked the boy who dressed him up so nicely. Vincent replied that his teacher was the most beautiful in the world. Winston followed the boy out and greeted the teacher Helen, who was delighted to see him. Helen asked the butler if he would really go with them. Winston replied that, unfortunately, he could not accompany Helen and the young master. Helen decided that she and Vincent were being allowed to go alone and asked the butler to provide them with security. Winston was surprised and asked again if Lady Helen really wanted security as well. The butler looked shocked by the girl's request and answered as follows. Why would she need additional security? Helen was surprised why the butler didn't know such basic things and how they could even go to the city for the festival alone. The girl couldn't understand anything. Helen stated that it would not be safe for her and the young gentleman to be together. After all, the boy was from the ducal house, and the teacher was worried. The girl heard familiar footsteps behind her. She turned around and was amazed by the unexpected appearance of the Duke of Cardiane. The man assumed a stern and angry expression and declared that they had been chatting for too long, and it was high time to hit the road. The Duke looked sternly at Vincent and Helen and asked how much time they needed to get ready. Helen understood the meaning the butler had put into his words, that she and Vincent did not need additional security. In the Empire, they said that those who dream of glory go to serve in the imperial palace. Anyone who wants to defend his faith puts on a cassock and goes to serve the temple. Those who dream only of mastery of the sword go to study and serve in the Duchy of Merchate. This phrase was incredibly popular among candidates for knighthood. It confirmed that the knightly order of the duchy was famous for its masters of fencing. Other families hired captains for the knightly order from outside, but Cardian himself had a talent as a swordsman and personally trained the knights of his duchy. Helen rode in the Duke's luxurious carriage and thought that, of course, the butler was right. If Duke Cardian himself was going with them, then they definitely didn't need additional security. Only Helen was worried about the mood of young Mr. Vincent, who clearly became sad when he realized that he and Helen would not be alone. Cardian is nominally the boy's father, but there is no relationship between them at all, and Vincent freezes even when simply confronted by the Duke. It was necessary to defuse the situation, and Helen said that she was glad that the Duke was going with them and asked Vincent to confirm this. The boy muttered a half-hearted agreement and fell back into his thoughts. Helen gestured for Cardian to say something that would allow his son and heir to relax. It occurred to Helen that Cardian and Vincent's relationship wasn't that bad. The boy believes that Cardian saved him from death in the slums of the capital when his own father abandoned him. In addition, the young gentleman bears the title of heir to the Merchate family and perhaps considers the transfer of this title to him part of salvation. At the same time, Vincent, living under constant pressure and fear of abandonment, finds it difficult to sincerely consider the Duke his father. The girl decided that she should take advantage of the opportunity and try to bring father and son closer together. Helen considered this her mission and decided to put maximum effort into fulfilling it, because she had with her a special card with Raven's recommendations. The festival atmosphere was captivating from the very first minutes of her stay. It was, as expected, bright and festive, even better than Helen expected. The high spirits lasted until Helen, Cardian, and Vincent arrived at the best restaurant at the festival, according to Raven. A dark and dilapidated building of a third-rate eatery appeared before my eyes. Helen, Vincent, and Cardian risked going inside, sitting at the table and even ordering something for lunch. Helen didn't understand. Raven said that this was the best restaurant in the capital. It was a long walk to the other restaurant, so they ordered even though there was only one soup on the menu and they were the only other customers. Helen suspected Raven of deception, or at worst, of a stupid joke, and was going to tell him everything she thought about him upon arrival at the mansion. Helen decided to try it first. Maybe the food would be quite tolerable, she warned Vincent, that is, the young gentleman, that he should eat carefully and not rush. The girl realized that she had almost given away her special relationship with the boy. Formalities had to be observed in front of the Duke. Cardian chuckled and told Helen that she could ignore him and behave with Vincent as usual. The Duke explained that he knew how close the relationship between teacher Helen and Vincent was, and she didn't need to pretend, they were just hanging out. Helen was surprised. It turned out that Duke Cardian knew their little secret with Vincent, and he was not at all against informal communication between them. The girl knew that Cardian was loyal to her, but she thought that he would be strict in formalities. After all, Vincent was the heir to the ducal crown. Vincent distracted Helen by asking her to help them with the soup they had been served. Helen suggested that the guy take a risk together and try what kind of dish it was, and they would buy sweets at the shops on the street. Vincent enthusiastically agreed to his teacher's proposal. For him, everything looked like a unique adventure. Very soon the plates were empty. Even the Duke ate every last drop. Helen didn't expect the food to be so delicious, even though it looked downright unpresentable. But she took Raven's recommendation into account. A poorly but neatly dressed woman approached the table. It was the owner of the establishment. She asked if the gentleman had eaten well, and they answered that everything had been very tasty. The woman laughed and said that the restaurant had been around for half a century, but she had never met anyone who didn't like her cooking. Helen was surprised that the restaurant had been operating for so long and that the food was delicious. But why were there no customers, and why was the menu limited to one dish? The hostess liked the young lady, and the fact that she praised her restaurant and food. The woman said she used to trade near the 4th District, but moved several years ago due to the Clean Streets policy. The restaurant owner learned the news late and was forced to move to this remote area. The hasty move caused all her regular customers to lose their way. Helen didn't know what the clean streets policy was and asked for an explanation. The woman explained that this policy was being implemented by the imperial family, which consisted of demolishing slums and expelling everyone who lived and traded there. They are building new houses instead of old ones, but other people are moving in. The old residents don't have the money to buy them. They just have to disappear. It's better to die. The owner of the establishment noticed Cardien and asked if they could have met somewhere before. Maybe he lived in the 4th district before. Duke Cardien looked sullenly at the owner of the establishment, his whole appearance showing that the woman was talking utter nonsense. Cardien didn't answer the hostess. He stood up, left the table, and left the establishment, indicating that it was time for them to leave. Helen voiced the Duke's intentions and paid the hostess for the food. The woman saw that the gentleman was dissatisfied and decided that she had said too much. The words of farewell echoed under the ceiling of the tavern. The door slammed shut, and the visitors left. Helen came out of the restaurant and saw that Cardien was waiting for them. The girl sighed. This man was a time bomb, not a person. Helen could understand Cardien. The 4th district was a slum, and Cardien was an aristocrat, so the suggestion that he could live there sounded like an insult. Another aristocrat would have already caused a scandal and claimed an insult to his dignity, so Cardien's reaction could be considered magnanimous. However, Cardien is not such a snob, and for him, such a reaction is a little unusual. To become so indignant in response to an ordinary question is somehow not his style. In addition, the man has a unique appearance, and it is difficult to confuse him with another person. The same applies to his childhood. Why did the owner recognize him? Cardien remarked that if Helen continued to stare at him like that, she would burn a hole in him. Helen apologized and justified herself by being thoughtful. Helen wondered where they should go next and asked Vincent where he would like to go. The boy laughed and declared that he felt good with the teacher and was ready to go anywhere. Helen thought that Vincent was a very sweet child. He was probably an angel, otherwise this sweetness could not be explained. She replied that she also felt good everywhere with Vincent. Helen asked the Duke if he had a place he would like to go to during this festival. However, Cardien also had no specific proposals. He was not a frequent visitor to such events. Duke Cardien merely repeated Vincent's words that he, too, was happy everywhere with his teacher, Helen. These words came as a surprise to Helen. They frightened her more than they pleased her. Helen didn't quite understand what that was. She would rather have taken it for mockery and ridicule than for a real confession. The girl looked at the bottomless blue sky and decided to pretend that nothing special had happened. Helen told her companions that since they were so lacking initiative, they shouldn't complain later that she took them to an uninteresting place. Raven's map was full of select information about all sorts of attractions. Cheerful music filled the city streets, and the artists diligently and selflessly performed amazing melodies. People were dancing and happy smiles were blossoming on everyone's faces. The holiday was in full swing. Helen watched Vincent and Cardien unnoticed. At first, both felt awkward, but over time, they became completely immersed in the festive atmosphere. Towards the end of the day, Helen and the men went to the souvenir shop to buy small gifts for the residents of the mansion, who did not make it to the festival, and for themselves. Here, the young Mr. Vincent took the initiative. The boy was unrecognizable. He was so liberated and relaxed. Helen also kept up with the young Duke. She wanted to buy Chelsea a hair clip. On one of the counters, the girl saw a wonderful brooch, which she decided to give to the boy. Vincent accepted the gift with unprecedented reverence and declared that he would keep it as a treasure for the rest of his life. Duke Cardien also received a gift from his teacher Helen. These were cool cufflinks. The Duke was surprised that Helen thought of a gift for him. The girl confirmed that she bought it for him, just like that. Helen expected the Duke to say whether he liked the gift or not. From the expression on his face, it was completely unclear what he was thinking. Cardien paused and said that it was inconvenient to fasten the cufflinks himself. Helen laughed, how picky the Duke was, and offered him her help. The Duke was stunned. Again these touches, from which he feels lightness in his whole body and clarity in his head. Helen came very close to the Duke and carefully adjusted the decorations on the collar of his shirt. To do this, she had to stand on tiptoe. Duke Cardien was much taller than teacher Helen. The girl straightened her collar and showed Cardien her work. The jewelry looked perfect. Helen walked away from the Duke, admiring her gift, and clarified that this way it would be no trouble at all to dress him. Cardian was pleased by the girl's concern. He looked at the gift with pleasure, but still did not say a word. Helen decided that Cardian was indeed a very mysterious man, but she was glad that he went for a walk with her and Vincent. Vincent was delighted with the gift the girl gave the Duke, and openly stated this, and Helen was once again convinced how much the boy differed from the Duke. Helen suggested going further down the street and looking into a few more shops, and the men agreed with her. Cardian looked as if he didn't care where he went, as long as the day never ended. After this, Helen and Vincent had a very good time. Cardian did not take an active part, but watched their games with obvious pleasure. The day was drawing to a close, and during their walk, they wandered into a remote corner of the city. The clouds were gathering, and it was clear that it would soon rain. It was necessary to urgently find somewhere to take shelter from it. Cardian suggested that they would have time to return to the carriage. Helen agreed. It was a pity to interrupt the fun, but there was nothing that could be done. At this time, Vincent walked away from the adults. Helen shouted at him to come back. They needed to hurry back to the carriage. Vincent asked to give him a few minutes. He had just met the girl and was talking enthusiastically to her. Vincent said goodbye to his new acquaintance and hurried to Helen. The teacher decided that the young gentleman's new acquaintance was selling flowers at the festival. The girl hurried off to do her business, and Helen, looking after her, wished that Vincent would have a friend his own age. The boy rushed towards the teacher with all his might, which caused the girl to become understandably alarmed. This little brat was moving too quickly and could fall. Vincent ran up to teacher Helen and earnestly asked her to bow her head for a minute. Helen leaned over and asked what the boy was going to do. Vincent silently placed a daisy flower in Helen's hair. Helen cried out in admiration. It was charming. That's what this wonderful guy had bought. Vincent thought that daisies suited his favorite teacher and was pleased that Helen liked his gift. Helen thanked the child. She was truly happy. This daisy meant that complete mutual understanding had been established between them. The girl told Vincent that they needed to hurry to the carriage, otherwise they risked getting caught in the rain and getting wet. Helen and Cardian decided that nothing was holding them back any longer, and it was time to return. But Vincent noticed that Helen's gift was missing. The boy was incredibly upset and shouted at the top of his lungs that his brooch was missing. He couldn't have just lost it. That was out of the question. Helen asked the young gentleman what misfortune had happened to him that he was shouting like that. The boy was already sinking into depression. He didn't know what to do. The first gift that his favorite teacher gave him disappeared without a trace. Helen realized that the guy had lost the brooch and decided that Vincent had dropped it somewhere, but Cardian immediately realized that the jewelry had simply been stolen by a pickpocket. Helen thought that this brooch was a meaningful gift for Vincent. Since he was crying so bitterly, he just needed to be more attentive. Duke Cardian walked up to his son and took him by the shoulder, ordering the boy to stop making a fuss. Tears won't solve anything, the Duke told Vincent. Action is needed. Is it really possible that the heir of the Merchate family will stand in the middle of the street and cry loudly, instead of finding the offenders and dealing with them? Vincent looked at his guardian with bewilderment and continued to swallow his tears. The Duke said that to give up means not having the will to return what has been lost. The tears in the boy's eyes gradually dried up, and his whole appearance spoke of his determination to take active action. Cardian noted that he now saw the look of a true young duke and future knight. The Duke knew perfectly well that the thieves operating at the festival were completely predictable. Helen looked at the Duke with apprehension. She was frightened by his decision to go after the thief. Cardian stated that since Vincent was still very young and had no experience in such matters, he would help him himself this time. The Duke invited Helen and Vincent to follow him and see how the professionals operate. Helen was surprised that Cardian, who had always been cold and indifferent to Vincent, suddenly showed open emotion and offered to help. Besides, Helen didn't quite understand how the aristocrat Cardian, far from the city slums, was going to sort out this matter. However, the girl did not object. She took Vincent by the hand and followed Cardian with growing curiosity. It seemed that the Duke knew exactly where to go. After some time, they stood in front of a dilapidated building that had not seen paint for a long time. It was hard to imagine that anyone could live here. A little earlier, a flower girl entered the same building. She timidly opened the door. Most likely, she will again be cursed and beaten. In the middle of the empty room, a gangster-looking man was sitting on a box. He angrily called out the girl's name. It turned out that her name was Mia. The man grinned evilly and invited the girl to come in. He asked if she had prepared money for him. The little girl climbed into her basket with resignation. Of course, she was able to get something. Several wallets that the girl had stolen from people having fun at the festival were laid out on the floor in front of the bandit. The bandit was pleased with the loot. The girl even brought a child's purse with some change. But the man said that even that would come in handy. He was in no position to be squeamish. The bandit said that Mia was lucky. Soon, under the pretext of cleaning the streets, this place would be wiped off the face of the earth. However, if the girl regularly pays tribute to the bandit, he will take care of her and her sick sister. After this, the man shouted at Mia not to hang around there, since there were still flowers left in the basket. She should go and sell them all without leaving anything behind. The bandit's screams frightened the girl, and she decided to leave while he was still in a good mood and hadn't started beating her. The man screamed even louder and more terrifyingly, "Was she really still here?" And the girl hurried to the exit. However, Mia was unable to go out into the street. The door opened right in front of her nose, and on the threshold she saw a gentleman even more menacing than her bandit master. The basket fell to the floor. The daisies scattered and mixed with the dirt, and a rumble rumbled over Mia's head, as if everyone knew perfectly well that she would be here. The formidable Duke of Cardian stood at the door and announced that the places where rats were found were quite predictable. The sword gleamed menacingly in the Duke's hands. He boldly entered the door and asked who dared to rob Duke Mercedes. Not long before this moment, Cardian, along with Helen and Vincent, entered an abandoned alley. Helen asked where he had brought them. Cardian replied that they had come to the lair of the foxes, the refuge of those who imagined themselves to be the shadow kings of the streets. Helen saw signs of similarity in this house to a thieves' den. Cardian asked Helen and Vincent not to leave him and to be careful. Cardian, Vincent, and Helen approached the door to the criminal's lair. The Duke drew his sword and prepared for the worst. As soon as Cardian, Vincent, and Helen entered the fox lair, they were attacked by many fighters of this clan. However, thanks to Cardian's skill, none of them were able to get even within arm's reach of the teacher and the boy. Cardian, Vincent, and Helen fought their way to the main room where the gang leader was sitting. The first person Vincent saw was Mia. The young Duke pointed his finger at the girl and shouted that it was she, that she was to blame for the disappearance of Helen's gift. The leader brazenly asked Cardian who he was and why he had come here. He tried to call one of his lackeys, but they had long since run away. Cardian pointed the leader to the entrance, where his guards lay unconscious, and advised him to clean up the trash on the porch. The bandit became angry, drew his sword, and rushed at Duke Cardian with the sole purpose of killing the impudent man who had encroached on his power. The leader was not a bad fighter. Otherwise, he would not have been able to achieve such a high position in the gang. The man moved dexterously and quickly. The bandit had self-confidence and outright impudence on his side. He rushed at the Duke, shouting that he would make him regret visiting him. However, no bandit in the Empire could match the skill of swordsmanship or knife fighting with Duke Cardian himself. Not a muscle moved on His Excellency's face as he dodged the daggers that the leader of the Fox gang threw at him. But after just a few seconds, the bandit was defeated, and Cardian's breathing didn't even quicken. The Duke ordered the bandit to be silent. He even promised to let him go if he received answers to his questions. The chief fox was pinned to the floor by the Duke's boot and felt the full force of the man's immense strength. Cardian underestimated the agility of his opponent. The leader turned out to be very nimble, and in an incredible way, he slipped out from under the Duke's boot and disappeared a second later. Helen watched what was happening with interest. She was a little scared, but under the protection of Duke Cardian, she felt confident. Vincent concentrated all his attention on the girl left in the room. He was sure that it was she who stole the brooch from him. Cardian and Helen witnessed how the boy was able to resolve conflicts that arose. Vincent came up close to the confused girl and looked at her carefully. Helen was afraid that he was going to hit this unfortunate girl now. Vincent extended his hand to the thief. Mia decided that she was about to be hit and tried to cover her face with her hands. There was no blow, and the girl stared at the young gentleman with huge, uncomprehending eyes. Vincent demanded that the girl return his treasure. His voice was firm and decisive. Helen noticed that her student was able to communicate with people and did not run away from problems. Mia immediately understood what the young gentleman wanted from her. The leader had not yet managed to hide the things she had brought, so there was no problem with returning the brooch. All Mia had to do was bend down and pick up the brooch, and the girl did just that. The tramp handed Vincent his jewelry and asked him to forgive her for the crime she had committed. Mia explained that she didn't need anything herself. She gave these things to the bandits in exchange for protection and the promise to cure her little sister. The girl grabbed Vincent's hand tightly and pulled him along with her. She decided to show him her sister so that the boy would believe her and not get angry. Cardian and Helen experienced several anxious minutes when the tramp took off and pulled Vincent towards the gray wall. Vincent himself was a little frightened by the decisive attitude of his new acquaintance. The girl held his hand tightly and pulled him along. All he could do was obey. Unexpectedly, the wall turned out to be not monolithic. There was a passage here that no one noticed at first. Helen immediately followed the children. She could not allow anything to happen to Vincent. As soon as Helen entered the secret passage, a long-standing unpleasant smell hit her nose. The girl was shocked by the extreme poverty and unsanitary conditions. Could children really live in such conditions? The place they ended up in could hardly be called a room. Another child was peeking out from behind the tramp girl. He was even paler and more transparent than she was, although it seemed that he could not be paler. The tramp fell to her knees before the gentleman and confessed that she had stolen because of her little sister, who was sick and could not speak properly. Helen believed the girl, but the situation was quite complicated. In any case, this little girl was a thief and a criminal, and she couldn't be left on the street. Cardian felt no compassion for people of this contingent and looked at this whole picture with complete indifference. The child, lying on some kind of bed, began coughing, and it seemed as if he was about to spit out his lungs, so loudly and with such effort was he coughing. The tramp girl got scared and rushed to her sister, but Helen got ahead of her. Helen grabbed the child in her arms and announced that he needed to be shown to a doctor immediately, otherwise he might die. Cardian asked what Helen intended to do and why she needed all this in general. They had found Vincent's brooch and could now leave in peace. Helen was indignant at how he could talk so calmly about leaving if children were dying here. The girl didn't believe that Cardian was so heartless that he would leave the children unattended in this disgusting place. Helen rushed to the Duke and declared that the child was in a very serious condition and needed to be shown to a doctor immediately. Cardian asked whether Helen was really planning to help children who had nothing to do with her. Helen replied that not only was she going to, but she would definitely help. It was not their fault that cruel adults had condemned them to such an existence. Cardian said that these are rats, not people, and they live in the garbage, eat scraps, steal. So is Helen's favorite activity really charity? Cardian's words pierced Helen's heart like a small dagger. But she could not abandon these children. They strongly reminded Helen of her own situation. In her past life, she was also lonely and desperately wanted someone to be by her side, so she couldn't turn her back on these children. Helen stated that these are small, innocent children, and they definitely need help. Adults have a responsibility to help children and not abandon them to their fate, so Helen was going to do everything she could to help these children. The teacher's decisive insistence surprised Cardian incredibly. He hadn't met such a selfless girl for a long time. Cardian sighed. Helen was hopeless, and arguing with her was in vain. The man had taken her sick child away from her. The Duke offered to take the poor fellow to the hospital, where Cardian knew the doctor well. Cardian carried the sick baby to the carriage, followed by the child's older sister, who was quietly snoring and could not believe her luck. Vincent and Helen ran alongside each other. The girl did not expect that the Duke would take on the main task of rescuing the baby. Cardian provided treatment at the hospital owned by the Merchet's family. The eldest girl went to the Merchet's shelter, and Vincent made his first friend. Vincent suffered from social neurosis and could not stand human company, but he was not afraid of these spirit children and willingly communicated with them. Helen hoped that communication with peers would help the boy study at the academy in the future, and she even managed to persuade Cardian not to resist this. Of course, the young gentleman was still a long way from fully recovering, but Helen was glad of such progress, especially since loyal friends had never bothered anyone. Helen spent this day in incredible tension and fuss. Now that everything was settled, she just wanted to relax. If Helen had known what the desired vacation would turn out to be for her, she would have preferred not to vacation at all. When Helen, Vincent, and Cardian left the shelter where they left Mia, it started to rain heavily, and they had to somehow get to the carriage. They decided not to take any risks and stayed at the nearest hotel. Vincent was completely exhausted and fell asleep on the Duke's shoulder. The sad news was that there was only one room in the hotel, and they would all have to spend the night together. The room turned out to be much more spacious and comfortable than Cardian and Helen had expected, and they could fit in it quite comfortably. Helen decided that they were very lucky that they didn't have to run around in the rain looking for a place to stay for the night, and she decided to leave Cardian and Vincent alone and go away. Cardian stopped the girl and asked where she was going. Helen replied that the coachman should have already driven the carriage to the hotel, and she would go to sleep there. Helen would never agree to share a room with Cardian, and she wouldn't do it even for Vincent's sake. The Duke asked why she didn't want to stay in the room with them, whether he embarrassed her so much, or whether she was uncomfortable with Cardian's company. The man remarked ironically that Lady Helen was probably afraid that he would encroach on her honor and did not trust him. Helen categorically objected. Cardian did not bother her. She tolerated the gentleman's company normally and was not at all afraid of any encroachments on his part. Cardian asked why, in that case, she insisted on spending the night in a cold carriage, just so she could sleep separately. Helen made an excuse that she was doing this only to make his lordship comfortable, and so as not to disturb him. Cardian asked what made Helen so sure that she could make the Duke uncomfortable with her presence. Helen hesitated, but the Duke categorically stated that her presence would not cause him discomfort. On the contrary, he felt better next to her. If Helen has nothing to say in response, and she also doesn't feel any hostility towards him, then they will spend the night in the same room, Cardian ordered. Cardian dismissed all of Helen's protests and arguments. The man didn't want to listen to any of the girl's objections. The Duke stated categorically that she would sleep in this room, and he did not want to listen to anything else. Helen asked where his lordship would sleep, and Cardian replied that the sofa in this room was very comfortable for him. The girl objected that it was too much for her to take up the bed when her employer slept on the sofa. The Duke meanwhile took his sleeping place and made himself comfortable. Cardian irritably stated that she was talking too much and was preventing him from resting. She just needed to go and lie down in bed. That was all he required of her. Helen thought that this man was impossible to understand, resigned herself to the inevitable, wished the Duke good night, and went to bed. Helen took off her outerwear. Parting with her dress was out of the question. Cardian's display of concern haunted her. The girl sat on the bed. Vincent was fast asleep. This day was full of impressions for him, and he was completely exhausted. Helen was touched by how sweet and charming the boy looked in his sleep, and who came up with the idea of calling him a little devil. The girl could not understand why she was so attached to this boy, but he seemed to her the most beautiful child in the world. Helen remembered her reluctance to spend the night with the Duke in the same room, but she had to come to terms with the current situation and sleep peacefully. Helen remembered the saying that if violence is inevitable, you need to relax and enjoy it, and she fell asleep peacefully. At night, everyone slept peacefully. The bad weather outside contributed to a sound sleep for both the boy and the adults. The Duke felt quite comfortable on the sofa. As a professional soldier, he was accustomed to resting in more Spartan conditions. Duke Cardian was probably even dreaming about something, but so far he hadn't shown any particular concern. Helen slept soundly, but still she was not used to sleeping in clothes, and therefore she was unable to sleep soundly. Lady Helen's sleep was disturbed by strange, quiet sounds that suddenly appeared in the night silence of the room. Helen woke up and sat up in bed. The sounds did not disappear. They became clearer and louder. Helen stood up and tried to find out the source of these sounds, but she was afraid that they would wake Vincent up. The source was quickly found. It was Duke Cardian, but the sounds coming from his throat were unlike anything else. It seemed to Helen that Duke Cardian was experiencing severe pain. Could those dreams really be returning again? The girl became worried. Helen assumed that the Duke was having a nightmare again. But why now? The girl thought that his condition had stabilized. Helen asked if Duke Cardian could hear her voice. Maybe he was just snoring a little, and the rest was Helen's guess. However, everything turned out to be much more serious. Duke Cardian was unconscious. Helen was afraid that his magic would get out of control again, like last time, and it could have disastrous consequences. The girl decided that she had no other choice but to use her powers and fix the Duke's dream. Helen was just about to activate the warm light when something unexpected happened. Cardian grabbed her hand and squeezed it tightly. There was no way to escape from his grip. Helen was scared. Could it be that Cardian wasn't sleeping? Then why was he groaning and tossing and turning? The girl again felt herself being drawn into someone else's dream, and she could not resist. Helen came to her senses from the growing light, flowing around her in tangible waves. Then it became dark, and she realized that she had entered Cardian's dream. Helen heard the sound of a chase. Some people rushed past screaming to grab him. The girl turned around at the sound of screams and what she saw shocked her to the depths of her soul. A child slipped past her like a shadow. The boy tried to be as inconspicuous as possible. A huge man was running after him in huge leaps and shouting loudly to catch the thief. The child ran as fast as he could, his only goal being to escape from his pursuers. The boy slid into the gateway, but lost his grip and flew head over heels straight onto the pavement. Helen looked in after him and almost burst into tears from annoyance and pity. Two guys were kicking a small, dirty boy. He didn't resist, only trying to cover his head with his hands. The men trampled the guy with their boots and shouted that he was a rat and did not dare crawl here from the sewer of the 4th sector and steal on their territory. For some reason known only to them, the boys left the boy alone and declared that if he was caught again, he would be dead. The men left, arguing that the little bastard had ruined all their luck that day. Helen noted that in Cardian's nightmares, there is always a little boy who is never protected by adults. A huge red apple magically appeared in the boy's hand, and Helen reasoned that if it was a dream, then anything was possible. The child was delighted with the apple and immediately decided to bite off a piece from the rosy side. Helen watched the boy and assumed that this was a projection of the Duke himself. He sees himself as a small, bullied boy. Suddenly, Cardian's voice was heard behind Helen, confirming that the child was indeed him. Helen was surprised how Duke Cardian could find himself in his own dream. But next to her, Cardian also looked at her with bewilderment. For him, such a situation was also happening for the first time. The Duke assumed that it was Helen who should explain this situation, this place, and her own presence here to him. Cardian was impatient and demanded that Helen explain everything to him immediately, or she would continue to remain silent. The Duke suggested that Helen's teacher was actually a spy, but the girl was indignant, as this was not true at all. Helen realized that she would have to tell Cardian everything, both about her abilities and about why she came to his mansion. Helen asked him not to shout, but to listen to her carefully, and admitted that she had one rare ability. She could change other people's dreams. Helen admitted that she thought Cardian was suffering from nightmares, so she wanted to help him, but everything didn't go as usual, and the girl found herself inside a dream. The Duke was surprised. He had only heard about such an ability, but he had never met people who could create sleep. Cardian asked if the dreams about animals that he sometimes had were really all Helen's doing. The Duke chuckled, judging by the fact that Helen was embarrassed. He was right, and it was she who had inspired those funny dreams in him. Helen was indignant. But what was wrong with dreams with funny and cute animals? They weren't nightmares, and they didn't give him a headache. Cardian smiled and said that he once had a dream in which Helen, in the form of a rabbit, was stealing carrots. Helen felt embarrassed. She wanted to rid Cardian of his nightmares so much that she went a little overboard. Cardian and Helen watched the boy. He began to come to his senses. The Duke asked if this was the first time Helen had entered someone else's dream, and the girl confirmed it. Helen explained that her ability was not complete. She could replace dreams, but not control their content. Initially, she could not look into them. While Helen was explaining her ability to Cardian, she herself realized that it could initially be described as allowing one to see good dreams. The girl realized that her ability had improved, but what could have caused this was unclear. Helen saw no other reason to improve her ability to influence other people's dreams other than the influence of a powerful magician on her. There was only one mage of such power that he could influence her mana, Duke Cardian. The girl was secretly watching the boy in the dream. He seemed to see her. Everything was exactly the same as the last time she found herself in the dungeon of the ancient temple. Helen looked at the boy without taking her eyes off him. Only this time, she was no less confused and surprised. The boy responded in kind, only he didn't remember their previous meeting and didn't take his eyes off Helen. The girl felt as if she had met the boy's gaze. The Duke told Helen a very important fact. Cardian was sure that this dream was definitely based on his memories. But there was a very important nuance. Cardian admitted that he had no memories of the past, which greatly surprised Helen. The girl asked why there were no memories, and whether there had been some kind of accident. The Duke replied that all he remembered was his mother, who abandoned him, and a life that was more like that of a garbage rat. Apart from this, there was only one vivid memory, after which Cardian's story began. This memory was the moment when the boy Cardian was picked up and adopted into the Merchet family. The novel mentioned that Cardian lived on the streets, but Helen didn't know he had such a terrible childhood. The author of the novel was too cruel to his hero. Not only that, he made him the main villain. Helen generally felt that the character of Duke Cardian was created only to emphasize how happy the main characters of the novel were. Cardian's end in the original version of the novel was tragic and lonely, much more so than anyone else's. The Duke's life was specifically written so that he would experience as much pain as possible. Helen sympathized with Cardian and wanted to help. The girl confessed to the Duke that at least while she was at the Merchet's estate, she wanted to be of use to his lordship. Helen wanted the Duke to hear and understand. She just wants him to be happy. The Duke looked at Helen without looking away. He couldn't decide whether to believe her or not. Cardian asked whether teacher Helen was in her right mind, and how she decided to make him happy. The girl came to her senses. The phrase had indeed sounded somewhat ambiguous. Helen laughed and told Cardian that she would take his statement as a compliment. Suddenly, that same warm light that had helped the girl drift off to sleep lit up again between Cardian and Helen. At the same time, Helen clearly felt someone's heavy gaze on her. She looked back and clearly saw the silhouette of a boy disappearing into the lilac haze. The hero of the dream extended his hand towards her, as if asking her not to leave him in this reality. This palm extended towards her remained in the girl's field of vision for a long time. Helen wanted more than anything in the world to grab hold of her and pull the child out of the nightmare that surrounded him, but she couldn't move. Suddenly, Helen came to her senses. For the first time after waking up, she could not understand where she was. Then Helen realized that she had safely returned from her dream and was in a hotel room. From somewhere below, Cardian's voice was heard, saying that he was certainly pleased, but it was a little difficult. Helen screamed in surprise and jumped to her feet. The situation was too ambiguous. The girl moved so quickly that she lost her balance and fell to the floor next to the sofa. The sensations she experienced at this time could hardly be called pleasant, since Helen hit herself painfully. The girl complained to his lordship about pain in her butt. The floor in the hotel was stone, and the girl hit herself hard. Cardian looked around. Just like Helen, he did not immediately come to his senses, but was glad that they had safely returned to reality. Helen considered their return to be a great success. She did not want to be stuck in someone else's dream. The Duke wanted to say something to the girl, but changed his mind at the last moment, which greatly intrigued her. Cardian turned away from Helen. It was clear that he had mixed feelings towards her. His lordship ordered that teacher Helen get ready quickly. As soon as Vincent woke up, they would immediately return to the mansion. Helen replied that she would be ready in about 15 minutes, but she was very interested in what the Duke wanted to ask. The trip to the festival was full of incidents, but it also ended safely, and the travelers returned to the mansion. Helen was terribly tired. So many events had happened in just one day that sometimes it would not be possible to fit them all into a month. Thanks to the events of these days, Helen found answers to some questions about Duke Cardian. The most important fact was that the Duke remembered practically nothing about his childhood. Since it turns out that his lordship does not remember, Helen decided that she must find out everything herself, and by doing so, she would, first of all, change her own future. At this time, the butler reported that while the Duke was away, a messenger from His Highness the Crown Prince had arrived. The prince asked me to tell his lordship that he was going to visit him, and if the Duke avoided meeting him this time, he would take it as an insult. Cardian asked again if he had really said that, and the butler confirmed that he had read the prince's message, word for word. The Duke had no time for the prince, but since His Highness had decided to come himself, Cardian could not stop him. Cardian asked the butler to tell the Crown Prince that he understood everything perfectly. After the festival adventure marathon, Helen slept all day and was awakened by Chelsea's attempt to air out the room. The maid tried to move quietly, but teacher Helen was no longer asleep. Helen thanked Chelsea for closing the curtains so that the sunlight wouldn't disturb her sleep. The girl understood that although Chelsea looked unperturbed, she was actually kind and treated her well. Chelsea was pleased to hear words of gratitude. She liked Helen for her cheerful and simple nature. The maid suggested opening the curtains and letting some fresh air into the room since Helen had woken up. Helen decided to give Chelsea a hair clip that she bought especially for her at the festival. The maid was surprised. Gentlemen never gave her gifts, and such a gesture from a noble lady was unexpected for her. Helen said she thought of it as soon as she saw the hairpin and wanted to give Chelsea a gift as a token of her gratitude for her care. The maid clarified that she was not mistaken. It really was a gift for her. Helen confirmed, and apologized if the hairpin did not suit Chelsea's taste. Chesley objected. She liked the hairpin, it was so shiny and small, She was afraid of breaking it, and therefore she would be careful. The maid promised Helen that she would carefully keep this hairpin as a gift from Helen. The girl was indignant. What nonsense! This won't do! She gave Chelsea a hair clip for her to wear and demanded that she immediately pin it in her hair. The hairpin suited Chelsea's face, which she and Helen noted while looking in the mirror. The maid liked the gift and didn't regret at all that she was helping Helen. Chesley sincerely thanked Helen, and the teacher was pleased that she had guessed correctly with the gift. Helen was distracted from her conversation with Chesley by the butler Winston, who appeared at the door of the room and greeted the teacher in an official tone. Helen was even slightly alarmed that it might have happened that Winston had switched to officialdom again. The butler reported to Teacher Flinton that His Excellency Duke Cardien Mercedes had invited her to his home on a very important matter. Cardien sat thoughtfully in his favorite chair in the middle of his office. Helen came in and stood in front of the table. She asked why he had invited her so urgently. The Duke replied that nothing special had happened. He just wanted her to take one thing from him, and he moved a skillfully crafted cross closer to the girl. Helen did not expect any gifts from the Duke and asked, puzzled, what it was. Cardien said that this is an artifact, and if magical power is poured into it, it turns into a sword. The Duke's message puzzled Helen even more. Why did she need a sword? She didn't know how to use it at all. Cardien was categorical. If Helen didn't need this artifact, she could simply throw it away. Here the girl simply became speechless from indignation. What is this man talking about? Even she can see that this is a very expensive magical item. At a glance, it costs as much as a medium-sized castle, or even more. The Duke asked if he could throw it away himself, but Helen objected, saying there was no need to throw away such valuable things. If the Duke doesn't need this artifact at all, then she will gladly take it. Cardien chuckled. This woman had fallen into his trap again. It was funny. Helen thanked the Duke and stated that she would be happy to use this artifact. Helen realized that beneath the Duke's outward rudeness lay a desire to take care of her. The girl left the office and thought that everything was fine. The Duke no longer suspected her and considered her useful because of her ability to correct dreams. There remained the danger that the Duke might learn of Helen's fatal illness, and then he might consider her useless. Helen thought that, despite the fact that she was an outsider in this mansion, she needed to focus on her main tasks. First of all, you need to meet that person as soon as possible, and to do this you need to go to the library. The custodian of the Duke's book treasures, Mercedes, greeted Helen kindly. Lemon Raven asked what books Lady Helen wanted to find on today. Helen smiled sweetly and said that she had come today for a different reason. The girl stepped closer to the young man and quietly whispered that she was glad to greet the master of the Luna Information Guild, Mr. Lemon. Lemon froze in place, like a stone statue, and lost the power of speech. Helen surprised him. The girl chuckled and told Lemon that he looked surprised, but in reality, she herself had not expected to find out so quickly. Helen was able to identify Lemon by checking the information in the primary source, the very same novel that she read in her past life. The girl remembered a scene from the novel that described Master Lemon dropping a unique key. Lemon was asked what kind of key it was and what lock it opened, but the secret of this key was never fully revealed. Lemon was described as a cunning and dexterous type who did not join any of the opposing sides. Helen reasoned that most likely the key that Lemon dropped was the key to the library of the Merchet Duchy. Considering that Lemon God could only get into the library undercover, there was only one conclusion to be drawn. He was the librarian. Helen smiled and noted that the butterfly of fate had chosen her. Lemon must come to terms with this and fulfill the terms of their bet. Lemon laughed like crazy. This can't be, he said, expecting anything but such a turn of events. The master of the Informants Guild could not even imagine that his special guest was the Merchet family's home tutor. Lemon searched for his special guest both in the ancient temple and in the imperial palace, but he never expected to find her here. Helen didn't expect such a strong reaction to her statement, and what if Lemon refused to fulfill the terms of the bet? Lemon stopped laughing and asked which side Teacher Helen was on, which party she had joined. Helen openly noted that she is on the side of those who support Duke Mercedes and his allies. Lemon replied that if that was the case, they should skip the unnecessary talk and move on to business communication. Helen didn't understand what he wanted from her. She had no business with Master Lemon right now. Lemon asked what Lady Helen wanted. Was it money, information about someone, or someone's death? Or was it revenge? Having won the bet with Master Lemon, Helen could only wish for the Information Guild to do anything for her. But the girl was counting on more. She needed the information Guildmaster Luna personally. She wanted to get Leon. Leon was intrigued by this girl. She was an adventurer at heart, which meant she was the same as Lemon himself. The master planned to agree to Helen's terms. He sensed potential in this girl and understood that very soon she would be the center of many events. Helen knew that only the Luna Guild could provide her with the information she needed, and she had to force Lon to cooperate at any cost. The girl asked if Leon was really going to go back on his word. That was the condition of the bet. And what about a gentleman's honor then? Leon warned the girl that she had better be careful with such words. Leon pointed out to Helen that they were alone here, and anything could happen, and there were no witnesses. Helen was outraged. This man was shamelessly threatening her with physical violence. She did not expect such a turn of events. The girl offered to sell Leon important information as an alternative to cooperation. Master Leon was ready to die, laughing at the information she could offer him, the main informant in the Empire. How could Helen know what information Leon needed? The Guildmaster said contemptuously. The man couldn't even imagine that Helen knew everything about what Lemon was looking for, all thanks to the very novel she had read in her past life. Helen suggested that Master Lemon would be interested in information about the cause of his mother's death. Lemon didn't expect such a proposal from Helen. He was surprised how she could know this. Helen replied that she knew not only that, but that she had information that he could not find, no matter how hard he tried. Helen knew that by the end of the novel, Lemon would find the criminal who killed his mother, but at this stage of the plot, he had not yet collected all the evidence. In the original novel, Lemon died after getting too close to solving a fatal mystery. Helen remembered that there were many gaps in the novel, so it was impossible to say for sure who killed Lemon, but Helen hoped to change Lemon's future. Helen looked at the confused face of the all-powerful Master of Information and asked if he would cooperate with her, on her terms, and Leon agreed. Helen was delighted with her small victory and demanded from Leon all the information about the ancient temple. There was one more wish. Helen wanted the Master of the Moon to find a book for her. Helen read this book in the Imperial Library, but she can't remember its title. Leon thought, in essence, Helen's tasks were elementary. She didn't ask him to do anything supernatural. The Master of the Information Guild chuckled. She should entrust the search for the book to the librarian. Helen was delighted when Master Lemon agreed to fulfill both of her requests. Leon was not going to wait long and demanded that Helen give him information about her mother's death, since she was not going to remain silent any longer. Helen asked whether Leon's mother was a priestess, although she knew this perfectly well, but she could not immediately reveal all her secrets. Leon confirmed that his birth mother was a priestess who served the previous saint. Only on one ordinary day did Leon's mother suddenly disappear from her room, leaving the window open, but she definitely couldn't fly. Several years later, this woman was found dead in a nearby river. It was not possible to determine whether she drowned or was helped by someone. The saddest thing was that Lemon himself discovered the body of the deceased, which had a painful impact on the guy's psyche. The exact cause of death could not be determined. It was strange that the mother's body was soft. Leon was shocked to the depths of his soul. He kept thinking that this was someone's evil joke, that his mother was just sleeping and was about to wake up. Helen told Leon one big secret. Known to few, if death occurs as a result of the use of divine power, the body does not decompose. Divine power is a kind of preservative, Helen explained. The obvious conclusion was that Lemon's mother died from the use of divine power. Helen said that this was her first clue. There were several more, but Leon should remember the saying that debts must be repaid. Leon replied that he would not regret anything for the information about his mother's death. Helen could be sure of that. Helen replied that she was pleased with the master's attitude and said that now it was time for her to go. Leon stopped Helen by asking if she was going to tell Duke Cardienne about her illness. Helen hadn't intended to do this, but she was confused, knowing full well that there wasn't much time left before the next attack. Leon suggested that the Duke could help her, but Helen was categorically against Cardienne knowing about her condition. Leo asked to explain the reason for her stubbornness. Helen replied that she had no doubt that the Duke would try to help her. However, Helen's intuition told her that it would be better for her to hide her illness from the people of the Merchet family. Leon was surprised who would talk about intuition. Helen demanded that Leon keep her state of health a strict secret from His Excellency. Leon agreed that since Helen herself did not want to tell the Duke about her illness, he would also keep it a secret. Helen thanked him and said that now that someone knew about her illness, she felt a little calmer. Leon and Helen shook hands. These two could count on each other in any life situation, so strongly were they now connected. Helen was relieved to think that all she had left to do today was to study with Vincent when the butler called her. Winston looked worried and hurried to catch up with Helen's teacher before she went to the classroom. The butler asked the girl to stay late. He urgently needed to consult with her. Winston told Helen about the invitation to the academy that Vincent had received and said that she should go there with him. Vincent received an invitation to the academy's bicentennial reunion and party. Helen carefully read the invitation lines. She remembered very well that the academy rarely organizes such events, only once every 50 years. It was a meeting to which the best graduates of the academy were invited, which meant that all the famous personalities of the empire would gather there. To be honest, Helen didn't want to go out in public at all. Did Vincent really need to go there? Despite her own doubts, Helen promised Winston that she would try to persuade Vincent to go to the celebration at the academy. Winston burst into tears. He was grateful to the teacher, but at that moment, Helen did not know how the visit to the academy would end. Classes with Vincent were over. The student was diligent and worked productively. Now it was time to rest. Helen asked Vincent to stay for a minute. The boy asked what the teacher wanted to tell him. Helen told the boy that an invitation to a small party had arrived from the academy. If Vincent agrees, Helen would very much like to attend this event with him. Vincent froze. He couldn't stand public events, but he really wanted to go somewhere with Helen's teacher. The contradiction tore the boy apart. Helen also wasn't entirely sure that Vincent needed to go to the academy. Maybe it was still too early to attend such celebrations. Helen assumed that she had spoken too hastily about this, but in any case, she decided to do as the boy wanted. His opinion was the most important. The girl was so surprised when Vincent told her that he would go to the celebration at the academy. True, the young gentleman set one condition. Helen must also go there with him. Otherwise, nothing will work out. The academy still seemed like a scary and unpleasant place to Vincent, but he was sure that if he went there with teacher Helen, everything would be fine. Vincent said that he had made a very important decision for himself. Now he would never run away. But he had one request for the teacher. The boy earnestly asked Helen to never leave him alone. That was the only thing he wanted. Helen replied that she solemnly promised to fulfill the request of young Master Vincent. Helen suggested that the boy make a pinky swear that they would never leave each other and would always be together. Vincent didn't expect that Helen would agree to his demands so easily and simply. A young girl and a little boy sealed an oath with their little fingers, and there was nothing stronger in the world than it. Helen was pleased with her student. Today he made the decision himself, without pressure from her. The boy has grown up and deserves praise. Helen was happy for her pupil. The girl realized that her efforts had contributed significantly to Vincent's maturation. The young gentleman was almost ready to enter the big world. Helen thought Vincent was great, but at the same time, she felt a little sad, like any parent would feel when they saw their child grow up. The girl reached out to the door of her room and opened it, and suddenly an envelope with a letter fell right at her feet. The small, neat envelope, sealed with a blue seal, aroused both apprehension and curiosity in the girl. A strange way to convey a message, Helen thought, but she decided to pick up the envelope. The inscription on the envelope left no doubt that the letter was addressed specifically to her, Helen Flinton. Winston burst into Duke Cardian's office with such speed that you'd think the old butler had aged 20 years. He moved so quickly. Cardian calmly asked what had happened, and Winston didn't have time to say 2 words before the door to the Duke's office swung open. A young, red-haired, handsome man in the ceremonial uniform of the Imperial Guard entered the room and greeted Duke Mercedes. The Duke wondered if he hadn't agreed to meet this man tomorrow, and why he had shown up today. It was Hesterion Ray Langrincia, the Crown Prince of the Empire, who explained that there was an urgent meeting scheduled for tomorrow with the Emperor, and he simply wouldn't be able to. Hesterion stated that he needed to see Duke Cardinos as soon as possible, and therefore he broke the agreement. The Duke and the Prince retired to a table, and Cardian noticed that the Prince had to quickly explain to him what was going on, as they were both busy people and in a hurry to get things done. It was clear from the Duke's appearance that he was not at all happy to see the Prince, and wanted to quickly finish all business with him. Hesterion said he didn't understand Cardian's negative attitude, why the 2 old friends couldn't talk over a cup of tea. The Prince wondered if the Duke had hidden something in the mansion that should not be shown to the Crown Prince. The Duke replied that this did not concern His Highness and asked to get straight to the point. Hesterion came to talk to the Duke about the assassination attempt on the Emperor, his father. The Duke asked if the case had been closed after it was discovered to be the work of Count Robert. The prince agreed with the Duke. That was exactly it. But he still had some doubts. Thanks to the influence of the divine power of the saint, the Emperor recovered safely and has already fully come to his senses. The Duke knew about everything and could not understand what the prince wanted from him personally. Everything ended well, and it was Duke Mercedit who was involved. The prince explained that it was after His Majesty received treatment from the saint that he began to behave strangely. Hesterion had in mind the clean streets policy. The prince was categorically against such measures, but the majority of the nobility were in favor of it. The prince did not sleep at night, discussing this issue with the emperor, and he managed to convince his father that the poor needed to be given time to resettle and compensated for the move. The emperor agreed to provide decent sums of money for settling in the new place. His Majesty did this as a sign of respect for the political course of the first prince. Hesterion was only the son of a concubine, but the age difference between him and the second prince was large, and his ascension to the throne was predetermined. Only the day before the clean streets policy was abolished, the first prince was attacked. There are many strange moments in this case, so as not to pay attention to them and close it. The Duke asked if the prince suspected the saint. The prince declared that he could not say anything with complete certainty, but after His Majesty had come to his senses, he did not want to listen to Hesterion at all. The emperor stated that he wished the clean streets policy to continue without change. The prince was sure that someone had interfered with the emperor's mind, and he had to find out who it was and what their intentions were. Hesterion earnestly asked the Duke to attend the upcoming ceremony at the Academy. The Duke did not understand why he should do this. He had no benefit from investigating a case that was already officially closed. The prince was indignant, but it didn't matter that he personally asked him about it. Maybe he would find at least a drop of conscience in himself. Hesterion asked as a friend and as the crown prince. Without the Duke, he was powerless to do anything. Cardian replied that this request sounded like an order to him. If Hesterion wanted to move towards a state of hostility with Mercedes, then he could continue in the same spirit. The argument escalated, and the men were stopped only by a polite knock on the door. The Duke asked what had happened again. The butler replied that Helen Flinton wanted to come in to see the Duke. She had urgent business that could not be delayed. The prince noticed that Cardian became worried and assumed that the Duke was behaving this way because of Helen Flinton. The prince suddenly jumped up and went to the door. He decided to use the appearance of the young girl to convince Cardian to help him. Hesterion personally opened the door for Helen and met the girl at the threshold of the Duke's office. Helen was surprised. It turned out there was a visitor in the Duke's room. She thought he wasn't answering because he had gone into a magical frenzy again. The girl looked closely at the unfamiliar young man. His golden hair and green eyes marked him as a member of the imperial family. Almost immediately, Helen realized that in front of her was the crown prince from the novel, Everybody Loves Only the Saint, who was also the main male character. Could this really be Hesterion himself? The girl held her breath. She could never have dreamed of standing so close to this idol of girls' hearts. There was no longer any doubt. It was Hesterion himself, and Helen fell into a state of prostration. She completely forgot why she was in such a hurry to see the Duke. Hesterion smiled sweetly and asked Cardian to introduce him to the lovely young lady. The prince decided that this girl was a very pleasant find. He did not expect that Cardian had hidden something in his mansion that he did not want to show to outsiders. Helen continued to look in surprise at the main male character of the novel, who suddenly spoke and asked who she was. The girl decided to behave with dignity and hastened to introduce herself as the young master's governess, Helen Flinton. She did not pretend that she did not recognize the prince. Hesterion thought her name sounded familiar, as if he had met her somewhere. Helen thought that the prince was talking nonsense, or that he had decided to hit on her, but how banal it was. The prince wanted to find out who Helen's father was, but Cardian rudely interrupted him, reminding him that he had a busy schedule and was in a hurry. Hesterion did not object, but noticed that Cardian did not like his conversation with Helen very much. The prince decided to retreat, citing his busy schedule, the late hour, and the fact that it was time for him to return to the palace. Hesterion informed Cardian that he was expecting a quick positive answer to the question he had asked him today. The Duke's answer was not polite. He wished the prince to get to the palace quickly and not to linger in his mansion. Hesterion laughed in response, convinced that he could beat Cardian and make him work for him. The prince unexpectedly took Helen by the hand and looked into her face with the piercing green eyes of the heir to the throne. Hesterion did not let go of the girl for a while, and then said in a loud whisper that he would like to meet her some other time. Helen looked at the departing man in confusion. Could it really be the real Hesterion? She couldn't believe it. Hesterion is the main male character of the novel, Celestine's man, and Cardien's successful rival in love. But before that, there was a completely different story. The connection between Hesterion and Cardien arose long before the current events. The boys learned fencing together, and Cardien found it much easier. The young duke often defeated the prince, which caused him obvious displeasure. Naturally, the relationship between the young people was initially tense. The prince soon realized that Cardien, although cold, was brave and honest. He was not at all like the sycophants who usually surrounded Hesterion. Despite the large age difference with the second prince, Hesterion had to strengthen his political position in order to inherit the throne. The prince did not find Cardien a particularly pleasant person, but he was not disgusted by the duke, and besides, the Merchet had always been an influential family. Hesterion wanted Cardienus to become his political ally, and did everything to make Cardienus the Duke of Mercedes. Very quickly, their relationship developed into a connection that was much more than just mutual need. If it weren't for some nuances, their relationship could be called friendship. It was cemented not only by mutual affection, but also by a connection in the political struggle. That was until the main character, Saint Celestine, appeared, who, as they wrote in the novel, is loved by everyone. The girl's green eyes pierced both hearts at once, and the friendship between the prince and the duke came to an end. Cardien decided to raise a rebellion against the crown prince, but was defeated and expelled from the empire. It seemed very strange to Helen. The boys had been friends since their youth, and suddenly, in one moment, they became irreconcilable enemies. Cardien asked Helen irritably if she couldn't take her eyes off the prince. The girl finally came to her senses, and the duke invited her to come in and finally tell her why she came here. Helen explained that the Imperial Academy would soon host a gala reception in honor of the bicentennial of its founding. Cardien knew about this very well. Winston had reported it to him that morning, and Helen should not have worried about such an insignificant matter. Helen said that she managed to convince Vincent to attend this celebration, and at his request, she decided to attend the celebration with him as a guardian. The girl said that the presence of parents would be more welcome, but since she was Vincent's governess, she would be able to be present as a guardian. Helen informed Cardien that she and Vincent would have a wonderful time at the Academy's celebration, and did not intend to distract the Duke from his affairs. Cardien looked at Helen silently. Not a single muscle moved on his face. The girl did not understand why the Duke was silent, and what he didn't like again. Suddenly, the Duke declared that the parents' participation in this celebration was obligatory, so it would look ridiculous if Helen went with him alone. "Everyone except Vincent will be with their families," Cardien stated categorically. Helen did not think about this and appreciated the Duke's tact. Helen immediately suggested that Mr. Winston go with them, in which case everything would look more decent. Cardien stated that this could not be done. The butler could not accompany the young master to the celebration at the Academy. Helen suggested Chesley's candidacy, but the Duke dismissed her as unworthy, so the girl said that Librarian Ravon could accompany them. The Duke also rejected the person of the librarian. Helen was perplexed why the Duke kept saying no. He really wanted Vincent to agree to go. Helen did not understand this man's behavior. As always, he behaved mysteriously. Unexpectedly, the Duke declared that he, the Duke of Cardien, was Vincent's guardian, and not the teacher Helen Flinton. The girl was slightly taken aback. She knows this very well. And what he wants to say by this is that Helen is meddling in something that is none of her business, or something like that. And then it dawned on the girl, well, of course, Cardien was offended that she had completely crossed him off the list of possible companions for Vincent at the holiday. Helen smiled and asked Duke Cardien to come with them, since without him, this celebration would not be solemn enough for Vincent. The Duke replied that if she asked him, he would have to put everything aside and go with them to the Academy. Helen didn't expect this. The Academy was an unpleasant place for Cardien, who suffered from uncontrollable bursts of magic and humiliation from his peers. Helen was glad that if Cardien went with them, then Vincent would also be able to overcome his fear, and the girl sincerely thanked Cardien for his consent. The teacher said that the young gentleman would be incredibly happy, and perhaps this would be a good way to help Vincent overcome his fear of people. Helen decided to tell Vincent this good news as quickly as possible. The girl informed the Duke that she would consider that his lordship had agreed to go with them. The next day, Helen met Master Lemon in the library. The guild leader was just climbing through the window. He was glad that Helen came to him. Helen was surprised why the librarian was entering her rightful place of work through the window. Lemon replied that he was very busy, and it was a long walk through the door. But he had news, and they should go inside and talk. Lemon upset Helen with the news that someone was systematically destroying traces of information about the ancient temple. Scientists, magicians, ordinary people, everyone who was connected to the ancient temples, disappear without a trace, and even their families do not know where they are. Helen was afraid that she wouldn't be able to find out who used unknown magic against Cardienne and what their goal was. The girl demanded that Lemon find out who is removing these traces. He needs at least some information about the purpose of these people and who is behind them. The day of the visit to the academy arrived. Helen always admired this educational institution and the appearance of its building, and on the solemn day of the bicentennial celebration, the academy was decorated in such a way that it did not at all resemble an educational institution. All the aristocrats of the empire gathered for the celebration. Many of them were graduates of this academy. A luxurious carriage pulled up to the gates of the academy, and onlookers wondered what family it belonged to. The most attentive ones turned their gaze to the coat of arms depicted on the carriage door. There was no doubt that the carriage belonged to Duke Merchetti's. The first to get out of the carriage was Duke Cardienne Merchetti himself. His lordship immediately found himself in the center of attention of the women. Everyone knew that he was handsome, single, and rich. The second to jump out of the carriage was the Duke's heir, Vincent Merchetti's. The child held himself bravely, but it was clear that he was a little scared. The appearance of the third passenger in the carriage caused shock and disappointment among the women, and burning interest among the men. Duke Merchetti's helped an elegant noble lady, whose name was unknown in aristocratic circles, out of the carriage. Helen was worried about Vincent, but she was completely calm about herself, especially since she noticed that Cardienne was wearing the cufflinks she had given him. Whispers began to spread through the crowd. Everyone was interested in what kind of lady had arrived with the Duke and what family she belonged to. Gossips were chattering that this unknown lady was his lordship's lover, and perhaps even his secret wife. Helen is used to the fact that as soon as a woman, no matter who, attracts everyone's attention, rumors begin to spread about her. During her time at the academy, Helen was often the subject of gossip, speculation, and rumors, so she stopped paying attention to it a long time ago. The main gossip was, of course, Anna. For example, she told everyone that Helen was dating Professor Jeffrey. Helen chuckled. She had told Vincent so many times that there was nothing to be afraid of here, but the academy itself caused Helen to feel a little afraid. Vincent noticed the girl's embarrassment and confusion. The boy was always attentive, especially to those who aroused his sympathy. The young Duke asked if his teacher Helen was okay. Maybe she was sick in the carriage and needed water. Helen replied that she was fine and mentally ordered herself to pull herself together. She had a lot to do today. The clock on the academy tower was counting down the time. There was still a lot of time left before the ceremonial meeting. Helen suggested that Cardienne and Vincent take a walk around the campus. She hadn't been here for a long time and wanted to remember her youth. Vincent happily supported the teacher. He liked everything that Helen offered him. It didn't matter to Cardienne whether to walk around the garden or sit in the hall waiting for the game to start, and he decided to join Helen. Vincent stopped near a majestic building. It made a huge impression on the guy. A real castle. Helen told the guy that this was a dormitory building. She also thought it was magnificent, and it had not changed at all since the day she graduated from the academy. Helen told Vincent that she lived in a dormitory and ate in the cafeteria. The food was delicious. She got up early, had breakfast, and went to classes. Helen remembered how she always looked forward to the one day a month when lasagna was served in the dining room. Near the dormitory, Helen found her favorite bench and invited Vincent to sit on it. The boy happily sat down next to the teacher. Vincent appreciated the bench and how comfortable it was to sit on. Vincent thought, Teacher Helen had many good memories of the academy, but the boy was still uneasy. Helen decided not to hide anything. She admitted that not everything was going well for her at the academy. For example, she didn't have many friends. The girl told Vincent that she was sometimes lonely, but she always loved to learn new things and study, and there were also ill-wishers. Sometimes they wrongly accused Helen of things she had not done or exaggerated her guilt. One day, Helen accidentally spilled water on a rare book. But fortunately, only the cover got wet. But the most important thing was the knowledge that Helen received thanks to studying here. No one could desecrate the volumes of information that Helen absorbed. The girl said that when she felt sad and lonely, she would come to court and read. This helped her to organize her thoughts. Ultimately, despite some not-so-good situations, Helen had overall good memories of her studies and life at the academy. Helen looked at Cardian and asked if he had any good memories of his time at the academy. Cardian thought he couldn't tell his heir that everything was bad. The Duke knew he had to say something. His silence was only worsening Vincent's trauma and making him feel unsure. It was as if Cardian had returned to those distant times, into the body of that small and weak boy. Helen and Vincent were chatting enthusiastically as they sat next to him, but they did nothing to stop Cardian from immersing himself in his memories. Helen noticed a boy the same age as Vincent, who told her that he had studied with a commoner who pretended to be a duke. Helen guessed that he was a student at the academy, and since he was the same age as Vincent, it meant that he was one of those who humiliated the young duke. The boy noticed Vincent and pointed him out to his father, who shouted loudly that this commoner had now come to the academy and was sitting over there on the bench. Vincent was completely confused. He wanted to disappear. He was so ashamed. Helen was afraid that he might suddenly have a seizure. The bully continued to mock Vincent, shouting that he was hiding behind a woman's skirt and reminding him of how he had thrown milk and juice cartons at him. Helen and Cardian guessed that this was the same bully who had bullied Vincent and encouraged others to do the same. What outraged Helen most was that her son publicly insulted the young duke, while his father stood nearby and remained silent, not intending to stop his command. Vincent wanted to run away, but he promised Helen not to do this. The boy chose to turn away from the offender and bury his face in the teacher's dress. The girl begged Cardian with her eyes to say something. The duke looked at all this and remained threateningly silent. The hooligan did not calm down. He asked his father when this commoner would be expelled from the academy. His father promised him that he would make him the young Duke of Mercedes. Helen couldn't understand what kind of nonsense this strange guy was talking about, but Cardian understood everything very well. The Duke stood up and walked towards the offenders. He knew this man very well. It was Count Drake Heidman and his son. Cardian introduced himself and loudly asked if Count Drake was ready to answer for his son's insulting words to the Merchetz family. Helen remembered information about Drake County. They were known for making a fortune from human trafficking and running illegal casinos. They said that thanks to their well-established connections, they are actively involved in criminal activities and are distinguished by their impudence and arrogance. Apparently, the younger Drake had absorbed all the worst qualities of his ancestors and was preparing to become a worthy replacement for his criminal father. But despite all the connections, the Drakes were just dirt in front of the Merchetz family. Count Drake recognized Cardian and fell to his knees, lamenting that his son had made a mistake due to his short-sightedness and asking for forgiveness for the foolish child this time. Drake forced his son to bow his head before Cardian and Vincent, forcing him to immediately apologize, which he resisted vigorously. Suddenly, Vincent came to his senses and his attack stopped. Apparently, the feeling that he was not alone gave the young duke confidence. Helen watched with pleasure how much more confident her pupil had become, and was glad. She quietly asked what Vincent was thinking of doing. Helen asked if Vincent was really going to forgive him after such humiliation. It was not becoming for a member of the Mercedes family. Vincent resolutely stood up from the bench and headed towards the offender. The young Duke Mercedes angrily declared that no matter what apology he received from Count Drake, he had no intention of forgiving him. The boy's figure expressed confidence, and his eyes glowed with righteous anger. Duke Cardian liked what his son had done and praised the boy for his very appropriate words and excellent expression. Count Drake Heidman clung frantically to Duke Merchetti's clothes and begged for mercy, saying that the children had made mistakes out of ignorance. Drake begged Cardian to show mercy and forgive his son at least this once. The Duke replied that perhaps the Count was hard of hearing, but he had been clearly told that it would not be Duke Cardian himself who would decide whether to forgive his son and his family, but his son, Vincent Mercedes. Count Drake did not expect such a turn of events. He was used to doing nasty things to other people with impunity, always choosing those who were weaker. The Heidmans remained on their knees, and in their ears the Duke's words sounded like a sentence, that they must remember what could happen to their family because of one mistake. Cardian, Vincent, and Helen, without looking back, slowly and with dignity, left the battlefield, where they emerged as absolute victors. Helen thought that she was scared. It turns out that if Cardian wants, he can easily destroy any count, but this does not mean that he will do it. Vincent held Helen's hand tightly and walked briskly next to her. Helen realized that the boy was no longer afraid of the academy. The young Duke looked at the educational institution's landmark with cheerfulness and interest. Helen was delighted with this metamorphosis, and moreover, she understood perfectly well that those children would no longer dare to mock Vincent. By the appointed time, Cardian, Vincent, and Helen approached the entrance to the main hall of the academy. There were a lot of people there. Helen was worried. There were only 10 minutes left before the meeting began, but Jeffrey still hadn't shown up. Suddenly, a red-haired guy ran up to Helen from behind, hugged her, and shouted that he was very glad to meet his old friend. Vincent and Cardian froze in indignation, and a worm of jealousy began to stir in the hearts of both Merchettis. Helen indignantly reprimanded the young man for his unacceptable behavior. He frightened her, and he began to ask the girl for forgiveness. In fact, Helen was happy to meet her favorite professor at the academy, Jeffrey Casper. He was always like this, and his behavior had not changed at all. Jeffrey said that he had been looking for her for a long time, and he was one of the reasons for Helen's visit to the academy. She really needed to meet him. It was Casper who sent her a letter in which he said that he had found out that she was working for Merchettis, and that was why he was writing to her. Casper reported that he had recently met Anna Liver, and that this meeting had amazed and frightened him. Anna was sitting in the Imperial prison, and immediately told Professor Casper that all her troubles were because of Helen. Lever called Helen a nasty thing, an idiot and a fool. Jeffrey was surprised where the well-bred lady got such a rich supply of curse words. Lever's reaction to Anna was not for him. Outsiders at the academy considered these girls friends, but he was not a stranger to Helen. Jeffrey wrote that thanks to Anna, he found out where Helen was now. He reported that he had one proposal for her. Casper was sure that it would interest Helen and suggested discussing it when they met at the academy, especially since everyone would be meeting there soon. A grand celebration of the bicentennial of the academy's founding is expected. The letter was signed, "From your only friend, Jeffrey Casper." Helen recalled that there were rumors about her and Jeffrey having an affair, but it was not true. He was a professor, she was a student, but over time they stopped communicating. Now he suddenly wanted to meet, and it was strange what Anna told him. Suddenly, a student from the academy came running and said that the graduate who was supposed to give a speech at the meeting was late. His turn was coming soon, and he wasn't there. Jeffrey looked at Helen hopefully. She was a good candidate to give the welcoming speech. Jeffrey grabbed the girl by the hand and shouted that only she could save his life and the honor of the entire academy. Helen didn't understand what the professor wanted from her. Casper explained that he was asking her to give a speech at the meeting. Merchettis. Kamor watched as Helen weakly fought off such an honor, and the professor became more and more insistent, begging her to save him from shame. Casper grabbed his head and bit his elbows. There was nothing he could do. He would have to silently watch as the meeting went to hell and the academy's prestige fell. The professor made one last argument. If Helen helped him with his speech, he would show her his office. Helen remembered that Jeffrey's major was theology, and she had always been incredibly interested in his research. Cardian instinctively did not want Helen to get involved with this man. He suggested the girl leave, but Helen hoped that Jeffrey knew something about the temple. Helen agreed to the professor's proposal, but Vincent didn't like that the teacher was leaving him. Helen replied that since Professor Casper was asking, she could not refuse him. Casper was happy with Miss Helen's decision. He was simply jumping with joy that the honor of the academy and his reputation would be saved thanks to Helen. The professor showed Helen where the platform was located and urged her to hurry. Time was running out, and the ceremonial meeting would soon begin. Cardian couldn't do anything, but he decided to warn Helen. The Duke really didn't like the professor. The Duke leaned towards the girl and whispered that she should be careful. Jeffrey did not inspire confidence in him. Helen was glad that the Duke was worried about her, but she did not consider Jeffrey a dangerous man and had absolute confidence in him. The girl, completely confident in her safety, followed the professor and his student. Graduate Helen delivered a brilliant speech, and when the long meeting reached its midpoint, she was finally able to leave the hall. The girl stood on the porch, still under the impression of the performance. She didn't really remember what she said, but they applauded her loudly. Professor Casper appeared and said that Helen had done a great job, and that thanks to her efforts, everything had gone smoothly. Helen grumbled that it was easy for the professor to say, but still, she was pleased. Now she needed to find Vincent and Cardienne. The professor suggested that the girl go to his office, as they needed to discuss an important matter. Helen objected. First, she needed to find her companions. Geoffrey said that he saw Duke Mercedes and his son leaving for the banquet hall. The girl did not believe the professor. Cardienne and Vincent promised to wait for her, and the three of them were supposed to go to the banquet. Geoffrey urged Helen to quickly go to his office so that they could return in time for the next event. Helen doubted it, but Geoffrey had no reason to lie to her. He had once been her friend. The girl followed the professor, convinced that nothing could happen to her on the academy grounds. Looking at the professor's back, Helen decided that she needed to try to get at least some information about the ancient temple out of him. Geoffrey, followed by Helen, left the academy building and walked along the path deeper into the park. Helen had never been to this part of the academy park and didn't know there was a small house there. Geoffrey said that this was his office. Helen was surprised. The professor was given an entire house. The girl decided that this was a strange place for an office. The protection on the house was too strong. Geoffrey explained that this was his second office, where he conducted more intimate and in-depth research. The professor was kind and offered Helen a cup of tea. He had all the supplies for this, and most importantly, fragrant tea. Geoffrey carefully treated Helen. She helped him out so much today, and she even had to strain her voice. The girl thanked him. The tea had a pleasant aroma, but she was in a hurry to get back and asked Geoffrey to quickly tell her why he had invited her. The professor was talking nonsense and was clearly stalling for time. Helen drank tea and thought that she should probably just get up and leave. Geoffrey stopped her and told her that he wanted her to become his assistant. The girl was surprised by this proposal. Helen replied that his offer was pleasant, but that it was impossible for her to leave the Duke and go to him now. Suddenly, the girl felt a slight dizziness. Through the fog, Helen heard Geoffrey say that Helen knew for sure about the Akabana. She recognized at first glance what even Eden Aquilium doubted. The professor demanded that Helen confess where she got this information. Helen's body stopped obeying her. She knocked over the cup and slowly sank to the floor, consciousness leaving her.